Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and we take the longer route through the strange parts of science, history and the human past. Tonight, we're going back to Europe more than 6,000 years ago, to a time before Stonehenge, before the great cities of classical Greece, before Rome, and more than 1,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. And what we are looking for is not a king, a tomb, a battlefield, or even a civilization that left us a written account of itself. We are looking for settlements, very large settlements, places built across the landscapes of what are now Ukraine, Moldova and Romania, where thousands of houses could be arranged across areas so enormous that, when archaeologists first began to understand their true scale, the obvious question was also the most difficult one. What exactly were these places? Today they are usually called Cucuteni Trypillia megasites, which is a slightly cautious name for something that looks, at first glance, suspiciously like an early city. The caution matters, because almost everything about these settlements becomes more complicated the closer you look. They were huge, but we are not certain that every house was occupied at the same time. They were carefully organised, but we do not see obvious kings directing the work. They had communal buildings and gathering spaces, yet no written administration has survived because these societies did not use writing. They could bring large numbers of people together, organise farming, produce pottery, exchange materials across considerable distances, construct houses in repeated patterns, and somehow coordinate the lives of communities on a scale that seems surprisingly urban. Then, after centuries of building settlements like these, the whole experiment disappeared. Before we go any farther, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and whether there is an ancient settlement anywhere near you. It does not have to be quite 6,000 years old. That would make the question unnecessarily difficult for most of us. Maybe there is a Roman town nearby, a medieval village, an old hill fort, or simply a place whose name has been on the map for longer than anyone can easily remember. Let me know in the comments, because tonight we are going to spend quite a bit of time thinking about how settlements begin, how they grow, and at what point a very large collection of houses becomes something we are comfortable calling a city. And if you find these quiet journeys into the distant past useful for relaxing, learning something new, or simply giving your mind somewhere interesting to wander for a while, you can leave the video a like and subscribe to Just About Earth. It helps this little corner of history reach other people who may also enjoy discovering that prehistoric Europe was considerably less simple than the schoolbook version sometimes makes it appear. Now settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let us go back to a period when there were no European capitals, no written maps, and certainly no planning departments, although someone seems to have been doing an impressive amount of planning anyway. The usual mental picture of prehistoric Europe is built from small things. A cluster of timber houses beside a river, a few fields cut from woodland, cattle grazing beyond the settlement, smoke rising from cooking fires, families living close enough together that everyone probably knows which household owns which animal, and who has once again borrowed a useful tool without returning it. This picture is not entirely wrong. Small farming settlements were a major part of life across prehistoric Europe, and for many communities the village was the basic social world. But between roughly 4,100 and 3,400 BCE, something unusual was happening farther east. Across parts of modern Ukraine, Moldova and Romania, communities associated with the Cucuteni Trypillia cultural tradition began creating settlements on a dramatically larger scale. Some eventually spread across more than 300 hectares. Thousands of houses could appear within a single settlement plan. Rows of buildings formed broad curves and concentric arrangements around open spaces, producing patterns that are difficult to explain as accidental growth. Communal structures appeared among ordinary homes. Paths and open areas divided sections of the settlement. Farming supported the people who gathered there. Pottery was produced in large quantities, and networks of exchange connected these communities with a wider region. This was happening at a time when most of Europe contained nothing remotely comparable in scale. Names such as Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka now appear regularly in discussions of prehistoric urbanism, although none of those names tells us what the original inhabitants called the places. That information is lost. We do not know what language the residents spoke. We do not know what stories they told about the founding of their settlements. We do not know whether people arriving from another community would have recognized a boundary, a district, a sacred area, or the home of an important family. No local historian recorded which household caused the most arguments, which gathering lasted far too long, or whose cattle repeatedly wandered somewhere they were not meant to be. What survives instead is material evidence, the remains of buildings, pottery, tools, food, pits, kilns, animal bones, burned structures, and the patterns those things form beneath the soil. Archaeology is particularly good at reminding us that people can organise extremely complicated lives without leaving behind a single sentence explaining what they were doing. That absence of writing makes the scale of the megasites even more intriguing. Large settlements create large practical problems. Imagine a farming village of perhaps a few dozen households. People can coordinate much of daily life through familiarity. You know your neighbours. You probably know their relatives. You know where their fields are, which animals belong to them, and which family can help when a roof needs repairing. If a disagreement occurs, there is a good chance that everyone involved already knows one another and that half the village knows what happened before lunch. Increase the settlement to hundreds of households and things become different. Increase it again until houses spread across hundreds of hectares, and the social problem changes completely. You now have people living in the same community who cannot possibly maintain equally close relationships with everyone else. Space has to be organised. Building locations matter. Paths must remain usable. Livestock need pasture. Crops require fields. Timber must be collected. Clay has to be gathered and prepared. Food needs to move between producers and consumers. Large gatherings require places where people can assemble. Decisions affecting one neighbourhood may affect another. Even something as ordinary as rebuilding several houses becomes a logistical exercise once the settlement is large enough. None of this means that a king is required. That is precisely where the Trypillia megasites become so useful for thinking about the origins of cities. We're accustomed to ancient urban societies in which authority announces itself rather loudly. Egypt gives us pharaohs, monumental tombs, inscriptions, temples, officials, and images of rulers. Mesopotamia gives us administrative records, temples, palaces, kings, taxation, and enough clay tablets to keep generations of scholars happily reading other people's ancient accounting problems. Later states across Europe and the Mediterranean also leave fortifications, elite residences, rich burials, public monuments, written laws, and other evidence showing that social hierarchy had become deeply embedded. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites do not present that familiar picture. There are large structures that may have served communal purposes. There is clearly organisation. There are repeated settlement layouts that required shared ideas about how space should work. Yet there is no obvious royal centre towering above ordinary households, no preserved bureaucracy recording grain deliveries, and no unmistakable palace belonging to the person who supposedly ordered everyone else to build several thousand houses in circles. This does not prove that everyone was equal, and it would be a mistake to turn prehistoric uncertainty into a pleasant story about a perfectly cooperative society. Human groups can create status, influence, obligation, and inequality in many ways that leave only faint archaeological traces. One family might have controlled more animals, another might have held ritual importance. Certain people could have been especially influential in negotiations, exchange relationships, marriages, ceremonies, or the organisation of work. Authority does not always require a crown, and powerful people do not always build themselves a palace. Even so, the visible evidence makes a simple top-down explanation difficult. Something coordinated these settlements, but whatever that something was may have depended much more on cooperation between groups than on commands issued from a single permanent centre. The layout is one reason archaeologists take that possibility seriously. When thousands of houses form organised rings and repeated groupings, we are not looking at a settlement that simply sprawled outward without structure. People appear to have followed shared rules about where houses should stand and how different parts of the community related to one another. Imagine trying to create that pattern without maps, modern surveying equipment, written building regulations, or someone sending an increasingly irritated email reminding everyone that the outer ring is not supposed to be 3 meters farther north. Coordination would have relied on people, memory, custom, measurement, negotiation, and repeated practice. A family building a house was not making an entirely private decision. Their building became part of a larger arrangement. That means individuals were participating in a collective design, whether the design was imposed by leaders, negotiated among groups, inherited through tradition, or produced by some combination of all three. The enormous open areas are equally interesting because empty space in a large settlement can be just as meaningful as buildings. A modern city planner knows that covering every available piece of land with houses is not necessarily a sign of organisational brilliance. People need routes, meeting places, working areas, access points, and spaces where activities involving larger groups can take place. Trypillia megasites contain substantial open zones, and some communal structures appear to have occupied positions that connected groups of ordinary houses. Without written descriptions, we cannot assign a definite function to every unusual building. Some may have been used for meetings, others may have been associated with ritual activity, communal meals, exchange, storage, or several purposes at different times. The important point is that not every structure looks like an ordinary household residence. People were creating places for activities that extended beyond the immediate family. That brings us to the population problem, which sounds straightforward until archaeologists begin counting houses. A site containing thousands of house remains seems as though it should have contained a huge population. Perhaps it did. But a map of all the buildings that existed across the life of a settlement is not necessarily a map of every building occupied on the same afternoon. Houses were constructed, used, abandoned, and often burned. New structures could replace old ones. Different areas may have been active at different times. If a settlement existed across many generations, its total archaeological footprint could contain far more houses than were occupied simultaneously. This is one reason estimates of megasite population have varied so much, and why the word city remains debated. A permanently occupied settlement containing many thousands of residents would fit comfortably into many definitions of early urban life. A place used more periodically, perhaps by people gathering from smaller surrounding communities at certain times, would represent a different form of social organisation even if its physical footprint eventually became enormous. That second possibility is worth taking seriously, because gathering itself can generate complexity. People do not have to live together every day of the year for a place to become central to their social world. Think about markets, pilgrimage centres, seasonal festivals, fairs, or meeting places used by dispersed communities. A location may be quiet for part of the year and then fill with people who arrive to exchange goods, arrange marriages, renew alliances, hold ceremonies, settle disputes, share food, organise work, or simply see relatives they have not encountered for months. In prehistoric societies without telephones, trains, or convenient group chats, gathering physically would have been the only way to maintain some kinds of wider relationships. A very large Trypillia settlement could therefore have combined permanent residents with periodic visitors, or it could have changed its function through time. Archaeologists continue to debate exactly how individual megasites worked, and the answer may not have been identical for every place. Whatever the population pattern, feeding people on this scale was a serious matter. The inhabitants lived in farming societies. Their food ultimately depended on land, weather, crops, livestock, stored supplies, and the labour required to keep those systems functioning. There was no distant province sending grain because a central administrator had filed the correct paperwork. There were no ships arriving from another continent carrying food when local production fell short. Fields had to be cultivated in the surrounding region. Animals needed grazing land. House construction required timber and other materials. Pottery required clay and fuel. Every extra household increased the pressure on the landscape, and a settlement containing large numbers of people would have needed an organised relationship with a much wider territory than the area covered by houses alone. Looking at a plan of neat concentric rings can make these communities seem almost geometric, but real inhabitants still woke up needing breakfast. Pottery gives us another view of that daily world. Cucuteni Trypillia communities are famous for carefully made ceramics, including vessels decorated with complex designs. These were not people living at the edge of survival with no time for anything except producing calories. Skilled craft traditions were passed between generations. Clay had to be selected and prepared, vessels shaped, surfaces treated, designs applied, and pottery fired successfully. Some production occurred on a significant scale, and workshops formed part of the economic life surrounding large settlements. Pottery also carried information that archaeologists can use today, because changes in style, technique, and distribution help reveal connections between communities. A vessel may have been a cooking pot to its owner, but 6,000 years later it can become evidence for regional interaction, household practices, and the movement of ideas. Exchange networks broaden the picture further. These settlements were not isolated islands containing thousands of people who had decided they wanted nothing to do with the neighbours. Materials and products moved through wider landscapes. Knowledge moved as well. The repeated appearance of similar ways of building houses, producing pottery, and arranging settlements suggests communities linked by shared traditions. A large site such as Talianki or Maidanetske therefore needs to be understood not only by looking inside its boundaries, but by looking outward at smaller settlements, fields, grazing areas, routes, resources, and the people connecting them. A megasite may have been impressive because of the number of houses within it, but its survival depended on a world extending far beyond those houses. There is also a very practical reason these places remained hidden from popular history for so long. A stone pyramid announces itself. You can stand beside it, look up, and immediately understand that someone invested an extraordinary amount of labour in putting it there. Earthen and timber settlements do not age in the same way. Houses collapse, wood decays, fields are ploughed, soil accumulates. Generations pass, and what was once an enormous lived landscape can become farmland with very little visible on the surface. The scale of the Trypillia settlements became much clearer through archaeological survey and methods capable of revealing patterns below the ground. Once researchers could map large areas systematically, individual traces began joining together into settlement plans. What might once have looked like scattered evidence of prehistoric occupation became rings of houses, open areas, communal structures, routes, and neighbourhoods covering an astonishing amount of land. That change in perspective matters because archaeology often depends on the scale at which you look. Excavate one house and you learn about a household. Excavate several houses and you begin comparing neighbours. Survey hundreds of hectares, and suddenly the question is no longer simply how one family lived, but how thousands of households may have belonged to the same organised place. The Trypillia megasites forced archaeologists to change the size of the question. Instead of asking why a particular prehistoric family built a house in one location, researchers had to ask how enormous communities created shared settlement plans without the institutions we normally associate with cities. And then there is the fire. Burned houses occur repeatedly across the Cucuteni Trypillia world, often in circumstances suggesting deliberate destruction, rather than a series of unfortunate cooking accidents. The practice immediately complicates our assumptions about what a house meant. Building a substantial prehistoric home required time and labour. Timber had to be acquired. Clay and other materials had to be prepared. Walls were constructed and maintained. Floors were used. Objects accumulated. Food was prepared. People slept, worked, raised children, hosted relatives, repaired tools, stored possessions, and lived ordinary lives inside these structures. Burning such a building intentionally was therefore not a trivial act. It may have marked the end of a household cycle, accompanied social or ritual events, cleared space for rebuilding, or served meanings that are difficult for us to reconstruct. Different burnings may not even have had identical explanations. What matters for now is that destruction appears to have been part of the system, rather than simply the event that ended it. Eventually, however, the megasite system itself did end. That is perhaps the greatest reason this story feels so unfamiliar. We are used to histories in which large settlements become larger, governments become more centralised, writing appears, monuments rise, states form, and cities continue in recognisable lines of development. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites do not follow that comfortable sequence. Communities learned how to bring together enormous numbers of houses and organise spaces on an urban scale. They maintained farming systems and regional networks capable of supporting these experiments. They developed ways of coordinating people without leaving behind obvious kings or bureaucracies. For centuries, the idea of the megasite was repeated. Then these enormous settlements were abandoned and the trajectory changed. That does not make them failed cities. Calling them failures would assume they were attempting to become something else, which is a very modern habit of looking backward and treating every prehistoric society as an unfinished version of a later one. The people who built these settlements were not practicing for Mesopotamia, Egypt, Athens, or Rome. They were solving their own problems in their own social world. If a megasite functioned successfully for generations, and then people chose another way of living, its abandonment does not erase what was achieved there. The more interesting question is why this particular way of bringing people together was useful for a time and why eventually it no longer was. It is also why the word megasite remains useful. Calling Talianki or Nebelivka a city immediately brings expectations with it. We begin looking for permanent dense populations, administrators, occupational specialists, economic classes, political centres, and institutions familiar from later urban societies. Calling the same place a village creates the opposite problem. A village usually does not cover hundreds of hectares, or contain thousands of houses arranged according to repeated large-scale plans. Megasite allows archaeologists to acknowledge the extraordinary scale without pretending the debate has already been settled. These places may eventually force us to broaden what we mean by urbanism, rather than simply deciding whether they fit a checklist created from cities elsewhere. For tonight, that uncertainty is actually useful, because it gives us the question we will keep returning to. How do thousands of prehistoric Europeans organise themselves on this scale when we cannot find the king? How do households cooperate when their community grows far beyond the point where everyone knows everyone else? Who decides where another ring of houses should go? Who maintains the shared spaces? How are farming and grazing arranged? How are communal buildings used? How much of the settlement is occupied at one time? Why build so large in the first place? And after investing so much labour in creating these enormous places, why burn houses and eventually walk away from the entire system? To answer any of that, we first need to stop looking at the megasites as isolated surprises. They did not suddenly appear in an empty landscape. Long before settlements reached hundreds of hectares, farming communities across this region had already developed traditions of house building, agriculture, pottery production, exchange, and communal life. Families and settlements were connected across generations. Techniques improved, population shifted, relationships expanded. Ideas about how a settlement should be organised were repeated and modified. The enormous rings that later appeared at places such as Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka grew from this much older social world, and once we understand the people who created that foundation, the megasites begin to look less like impossible prehistoric anomalies and more like the extraordinary result of several centuries of experimentation with how human beings could live together. To understand how settlements such as Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka became possible, we have to step back from the enormous rings of houses and look at the much larger cultural world that produced them. The Cucuteni Trypillia tradition did not begin with megasites. It developed over many centuries among farming communities spread across a broad part of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, especially in areas that now belong to Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Archaeologists place the broader development of this cultural complex roughly between 5000 and 3300 BCE, with different regional phases appearing as communities expanded and changed. At its greatest extent, the cultural area covered well over 200,000 square kilometres, which means we are not talking about one tribe living around one river or one unusually successful village that happened to grow very large. We are dealing with thousands of settlements belonging to related traditions that persisted for generations across a landscape stretching from the Carpathian region toward the Dniester, southern Bug, and farther east into what is now Ukraine. The double name can make the subject sound more complicated than it really is. Cucuteni comes from a site in Romania, while Trypillia, sometimes written Trypillia in older literature, comes from a site in Ukraine. Archaeologists working in different countries originally identified parts of what would later be recognised as the same broad prehistoric cultural phenomenon. Discoveries at Cucuteni in Romania during the 19th century and at Trypillia in Ukraine helped give the tradition the names we use today. Research in Moldova and elsewhere gradually made the connections clearer. So when we say Cucuteni Trypillia, we are not describing two completely separate civilizations that happen to meet one another. We are using a combined archaeological label for a long-lasting and regionally varied cultural world whose community shared many features while still developing local differences. UNESCO's recent transnational tentative list documentation reflects exactly this wide geographic character, treating the phenomenon as extending across Romania, the Republic of Moldova, and Ukraine, rather than belonging neatly to one modern national story. The landscape these people occupied was varied. Some communities lived near river valleys, others on elevated ground or broad plateaus, and the balance between forest, grassland, cultivated fields, and pasture differed from one region to another. Rivers mattered because they provided water, fertile soils, routes through the landscape, fishing opportunities, and reliable points around which people could organise settlement. The Dniester and Prut systems were especially important in western parts of the Cucuteni Trypillia world, while farther east communities expanded toward the southern Bug and Dnieper regions. This was not empty land waiting for farmers to arrive. Other groups had lived across these landscapes before and alongside them, and the spread of Cucuteni Trypillia communities involved contact, movement, adaptation, and probably a great deal of local variation that the archaeological labels cannot fully capture. Their economy was based primarily on farming and livestock keeping, but saying that can make daily life sound more straightforward than it was. A farming household in the 5th millennium BCE had to manage a constant series of practical decisions. Grain had to be planted at the right time, fields maintained, harvests collected and stored, animals watched, houses repaired, firewood gathered, clay prepared, tools maintained, and food preserved, well enough to survive periods when fresh supplies were limited. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs formed part of the domestic economy, while cereals and other crops provided important food resources. Hunting and gathering continued as well, because prehistoric farmers did not suddenly forget that forests and rivers contained useful things simply because they had learned to grow grain. Farming made settlement more permanent, but it did not make life predictable. A poor harvest, livestock disease, weather problems, or exhaustion of nearby resources could create difficulties that no amount of attractive pottery could solve. Houses were one of the most important units around which this society was organised. Cucuteni Trypillia buildings were typically constructed from combinations of timber and clay-rich materials, with walls formed around wooden frameworks and surfaces that could be carefully finished. Some structures were relatively modest, while others were larger and more elaborate. Certain sites preserve evidence suggesting internal divisions, raised platforms, ovens, work areas, storage arrangements, and repeated ways of organising domestic space. A house was therefore much more than somewhere to sleep. It was a place of food preparation, craft work, storage, family interaction, and probably many activities that would now be separated into kitchens, workshops, living rooms, and sheds. Prehistoric architecture had the inconvenient habit of asking one building to do several jobs. The household seems to have been a central social unit, but households were clearly not isolated from one another. From relatively early periods, settlements show buildings arranged according to shared patterns. UNESCO's archaeological summary notes that the earliest pre-Cucuteni communities were generally small, while later phases began to show buildings organised deliberately in groups or rows. As communities expanded eastward and settlement numbers increased, the plans became more structured. This is important because the later megasites did not invent organised space from nothing. Long before anyone laid out thousands of houses in enormous rings, smaller Cucuteni Trypillia settlements were already experimenting with how groups of homes could be arranged in relation to one another. That repeated organisation suggests that people carried shared ideas about what a proper settlement should look like. We cannot assume that every community followed a written plan, because there was no writing system of the kind used in later administrative societies. Planning could instead have been maintained through tradition, measurement, memory, agreed rules, and collective participation. Someone knew how much space should separate one house from another. Someone knew where open areas should remain. People understood how houses related to pathways and boundaries. When a new building was added, it usually became part of an existing social arrangement, rather than simply appearing wherever a family found a convenient patch of ground. That sounds ordinary until we remember that these conventions were being transmitted for centuries without architects producing blueprints or local officials issuing construction permits. Pottery offers one of the clearest glimpses into the cultural identity of these communities. Cucuteni Trypillia ceramics can be remarkably sophisticated, especially the painted vessels for which the tradition is famous. Spirals, curves, geometric arrangements and other designs were applied to bowls, jars, cups, and storage vessels in styles that changed through time and varied across regions. Some are so carefully made that museum displays can easily encourage the impression that every prehistoric household was filled with pristine decorative pottery placed at tasteful intervals. Reality was probably less tidy. Pots were working objects. They held food, liquids, grain, and ingredients. They were moved, heated, dropped, repaired, broken, discarded, and replaced. A beautifully decorated vessel could still have the prehistoric equivalent of a bad afternoon. The technical knowledge behind pottery production mattered almost as much as the decoration. Clay had to be selected and processed, tempers could be added, vessels shaped, dried, and fired under controlled conditions. As production became more developed, sophisticated firing installations and specialised knowledge appear in the archaeological record. That does not necessarily mean there was a permanent professional potter class working full-time, in the way we might imagine later urban craftspeople, but it does suggest that some people became highly skilled at tasks that required experience and careful control. Specialisation can begin gradually. One household may become particularly good at producing certain vessels. Other people begin trading for them. Skills concentrate, techniques spread. Before long, what started as household production becomes part of a much wider network of exchange. Those networks were essential to the Cucuteni Trypillia world. Communities exchanged raw materials and finished objects across substantial distances. Flint is one of the clearest examples because good quality stone does not occur everywhere, and its movement can reveal connections between regions. Salt was another important resource. Some early sites in the Romanian part of the cultural area were associated with salt exploitation, a reminder that prehistoric trade did not revolve only around visually impressive objects. Salt is not particularly exciting to display behind museum glass, but it is extremely useful if you need to preserve food, manage livestock, and live through winter. The fact that communities exploited and circulated resources from particular locations tells us that their social geography extended well beyond the boundaries of individual villages. Copper also formed part of this changing economy, although stone, bone, wood, and clay remained essential materials. The period is often described as Chalcolithic or Copper Age because people knew and used copper, but that does not mean metal tools instantly replaced everything else. Copper was valuable and technologically significant, yet a good stone blade could remain perfectly useful. Prehistoric technological change was often additive rather than immediate replacement. People used new materials alongside older ones, adopting them where they offered advantages and continuing established tools where those worked better or were easier to obtain. The figurines and other unusual objects found at Cucuteni Trypillia sites have encouraged generations of interpretations about religion and ritual. Human and animal figures occur in many forms, along with miniature objects and specially arranged deposits. It is tempting to assign each item a precise meaning, perhaps identifying a particular goddess, household spirit, ancestor, or ritual practice, but the evidence rarely allows that level of confidence. An object may have served several purposes during its lifetime, and meanings familiar to the people who made it can become almost invisible after 6,000 years. Archaeologists can identify patterns, contexts, and repeated behaviour, but they cannot simply translate prehistoric symbolism as though someone left a dictionary nearby. One especially puzzling feature is the relative scarcity of formal cemeteries associated with much of the Cucuteni Trypillia world. In many ancient societies, burials provide enormous amounts of information about age, health, status, identity, diet, violence, and social differences. Here, that source of evidence is much more limited. The absence of large, obvious cemeteries does not mean people had no formal way of dealing with the dead. It means that whatever practices they followed often left traces that are difficult to recognise archaeologically, occurred in places not yet identified, or involved treatments that did not preserve bodies in familiar graves. For researchers trying to reconstruct society, this is mildly inconsiderate of the prehistoric population, though obviously no one at the time was organising their funerary customs for the convenience of future archaeologists. Because graves are limited, houses become even more important for understanding social organisation. Archaeologists can compare building sizes, layouts, contents, production areas, and the distribution of unusual objects to ask whether some households were much wealthier or more influential than others. Recent research examining thousands of house sizes across Trypillia sites has suggested that the large aggregation settlements may, for a period, have limited household inequality rather than intensifying it. The pattern is particularly interesting because we often assume that larger populations automatically create stronger hierarchy. The Trypillia evidence suggests that social complexity and sharp economic inequality do not always have to grow together, at least not immediately. Some researchers have argued that increased differentiation reappeared over time and may have contributed to changes that eventually undermined the megasite system. That remains an interpretation rather than a final answer, but it gives us a much more interesting picture than simply imagining a missing king whose palace has not yet been found. Cooperation would have been necessary even in smaller settlements. Agricultural work often produces seasonal periods when many hands are useful. Houses require labour to construct and maintain. Livestock must be managed. Large quantities of clay and timber need to be moved. Ceremonies, feasts, exchanges, and marriages bring households together. Disputes have to be settled somehow. Children grow up and form new households. Families split, merge, relocate, and build new relationships. A village is therefore not just a collection of houses. It is a system of obligations between people, and that system becomes more complicated when communities begin forming networks across dozens or hundreds of settlements. Over generations, those networks grew across a very large region. The archaeological sequence shows communities expanding eastward and northeastward from areas closer to the Carpathians, eventually reaching the Dniester and farther into the forest steppe zones of modern Ukraine. Settlement size increased in some areas. Earlier small sites were followed by larger communities, and during later phases the extraordinary megasites began to emerge. This was not a single migration occurring in one dramatic moment. The process unfolded across centuries, with regional traditions changing as people interacted with different landscapes and neighbouring populations. By the time the largest settlements appeared, Cucuteni Trypillia society already had a long history of building houses in structured arrangements, managing agricultural production, maintaining exchange networks, and coordinating communities larger than individual households. The environment of the Ukrainian forest steppe offered particular opportunities, but also imposed limits. Fertile soils could support substantial agricultural production, while river systems and open landscapes helped movement between settlements. At the same time, very large communities required enormous amounts of fuel, grazing land, construction material, and cultivated ground. The farther settlement size expanded, the more carefully people had to manage the relationship between the inhabited area and the countryside surrounding it. A house might occupy only a small piece of ground, but the people and animals connected with that house depended on a much larger productive landscape. Multiply that by hundreds or thousands of households, and the true footprint of a megasite becomes much larger than the visible rings of buildings. This also helps explain why smaller settlements never stopped mattering. The rise of megasites did not simply erase the surrounding countryside and move everyone permanently into one giant centre. Archaeological evidence indicates complex settlement systems involving places of different sizes. Some communities remained small or medium-sized while the largest aggregation sites developed. That raises the possibility that megasites depended heavily on relationships with surrounding populations. Perhaps some residents moved between large and small communities. Perhaps certain families maintained fields at considerable distances. Perhaps food, animals, raw materials, and people regularly moved into and out of the larger settlements. The megasite may have been the most visually impressive part of the system, but it was probably never the whole system. Communal buildings provide another clue to how this world was changing. At larger sites, unusually substantial structures appear that differ from ordinary domestic houses. Archaeologists have interpreted some as assembly buildings, or places used for collective activities. Their presence suggests that settlement organisation was operating on several scales at once. The household remained important, but groups larger than households needed spaces of their own. A cluster of neighbouring families might share responsibilities or identities. Several clusters could form a larger section of the settlement. Representatives from those sections could meet elsewhere. This kind of nested organisation would allow large populations to coordinate without requiring every resident to gather every time someone needed to decide where the cattle should go. It is impossible to know exactly how these decisions were made. There may have been councils, elders, ritual specialists, influential families, temporary leaders, or people whose authority depended on particular circumstances. Leadership during harvest could look different from leadership during a ceremony. Someone skilled in organising construction might not be the same person who negotiated with visitors from another settlement. Our tendency is to ask who was in charge, singular, because later political systems have trained us to expect one clearly visible centre. Cucuteni Trypillia society may require a different question. How many different kinds of authority could operate at the same time without becoming a permanent centralised government? The repeated burning of houses adds another layer to this social world. Deliberately destroyed buildings occur throughout Cucuteni Trypillia archaeology. and the practice appears too widespread to dismiss as ordinary accidental fire. Burning may have been connected with rebuilding, household cycles, ritual behaviour, social memory, or transformations in the identity of a domestic group. Whatever the exact meaning, houses seem to have had biographies. They were created, used, repaired, altered, and eventually ended. A settlement, therefore, was never a fixed arrangement. Even when a plan looks neat on a modern archaeological map, the lived place was constantly changing. One house was new, while another was old. One family was expanding, while another moved away. Walls were being repaired, ovens rebuilt, pottery discarded, livestock shifted, paths altered, and buildings burned. The perfect concentric plan we see from above was made from thousands of messy human decisions on the ground. That is perhaps the most useful way to understand the Cucuteni Trypillia world before we arrive at its largest settlements. These were not people who suddenly invented urbanism because population passed some magical threshold. They inherited centuries of experience in organising households, villages, fields, craft production, exchange, and collective spaces. They had traditions for arranging houses and ways of maintaining relationships across long distances. They knew how to mobilise labour without written instructions. They could build communities large enough to require coordination and maintain cultural connections across a territory far greater than any one person was likely to travel routinely. The megasites were an extension of those capacities, though on a scale that introduced new problems. At some point during the late 5th and early 4th millennia BCE, those problems were accepted rather than avoided. Instead of keeping every settlement comfortably small, communities in parts of the Trypillia world began bringing extraordinary numbers of households together. The rings became larger, open spaces became broader, communal buildings became more important. Entire settlements expanded until crossing them on foot would have taken real time rather than a brief walk between neighbouring houses. What had once been a regional tradition of farming villages now produced places measured in hundreds of hectares. The next question is no longer how the Cucuteni Trypillia world worked in general, but what happened when that world concentrated itself into a few enormous locations. Because once we move onto the ground at Talianki, Maidanetske and Nebelivka, the scale stops being an archaeological statistic and becomes the central problem. By the time the Cucuteni Trypillia world reached its period of greatest settlement growth, something had changed in the way communities were choosing to live together. The farming villages we have already followed across Romania, Moldova and Ukraine did not disappear, but in the forest steppe of central Ukraine a small number of settlements expanded until they belonged to an entirely different category of scale. These were not simply villages that had acquired a few additional streets. Some covered 200 hectares or more, while the largest reached roughly 320 to 340 hectares. Thousands of houses were distributed across carefully organised plans, separated by open corridors and grouped around spaces that appear to have served larger sections of the community. Among the most important examples are Talianki, Maidanetske and Nebelivka, three names that now sit at the centre of the debate over whether prehistoric Europe developed its own form of urban life. They were not identical settlements, and they were not occupied at exactly the same moment, but together they reveal just how far the Trypillia experiment with large-scale settlement could go. Talianki gives us the largest landscape of the three. Depending on how archaeologists define the edges of the occupied area, estimates generally place it at around 320 to 340 hectares. Even the lower figure is enormous for a European settlement of the 4th millennium BCE. More than 2,000 structures have been identified through geophysical work and excavation, while some reconstructions put the overall number of houses at around 2,500 once incompletely surveyed areas are taken into account. The exact total remains uncertain because not every part of the site has been investigated equally, and because archaeological features do not always have the courtesy to end at a convenient line on a map. What is clear is that Talianki was built according to a large-scale plan in which rows of houses formed broad circuits, with streets and gaps providing access through the settlement rather than producing a solid mass of buildings. It is difficult to appreciate 300 hectares simply by hearing the number, so it helps to imagine trying to cross the settlement on foot. A person standing at one edge would not have seen a small village gathered immediately around them. Houses would have continued across a wide area, arranged in repeated lines and groups. Depending on vegetation, smoke, buildings and terrain, many residents could have lived far beyond sight of one another. A visitor arriving from a smaller farming community would have encountered something that demanded time to move through. This matters because physical size changes social experience. In a compact village, walking to another household may take a minute or two. In a settlement the size of Talianki, visiting someone on the opposite side becomes an actual journey. People may technically belong to the same settlement, while living most of their daily lives among a much smaller circle of neighbours. The enormous site therefore had to solve two problems at once: how to remain one community while allowing daily life to operate at manageable local scales. The house rows provide part of the answer. Rather than imagining thousands of unrelated families occupying a gigantic open field, archaeologists increasingly examine the megasites as collections of smaller social units nested inside the whole. Houses formed groups. Groups belonged to larger sectors. Streets and open zones separated one arrangement from another. This kind of organisation makes practical sense because human relationships do not suddenly become unlimited when a settlement grows. A household can maintain strong connections with nearby households. Several neighbouring groups can coordinate larger activities. Larger sections of the settlement can then interact through communal institutions without requiring every resident to participate in every decision. Talianki's plan hints at this layered form of organisation, although the incompleteness of the survey means we should resist the temptation to reconstruct its social system down to the last meeting place. Archaeology can show us that the space was organised. It cannot yet provide the minutes from the planning meeting. Maidanetske gives us an even clearer view of what this organisation could look like. The settlement occupied roughly 200 hectares and contained approximately 3,000 identified house structures over the course of its use, including around 2,300 burned structures and roughly 700 that were not burned. Houses were arranged in concentric rings that could reach as many as 8 rows deep in some areas. At the centre lay a large open space of about 25 hectares, while broad corridors, often around 70 to 100 metres wide, separated some of the house rings. Large non-domestic buildings stood within these open areas and have been interpreted as communal facilities or assembly houses. Radiocarbon dating indicates that Maidanetske developed through several phases between approximately 3960 and 3650 BCE, with its most intensive period falling around 3800 to 3700 BCE. Seen from above, Maidanetske is almost unsettlingly organised. The houses form curving bands around the central area instead of spreading outward as a jumble of buildings. Large gaps between the rings appear intentional rather than accidental, and the communal structures seem to have been positioned so that different clusters of households had access to them. Researchers have suggested that groups of roughly 50 to 150 houses may have been associated with particular large structures, creating distinct neighbourhoods or sectors within the wider settlement. The arrangement does not resemble a modern street grid, but it is still clearly planned space. Someone arriving at Maidanetske would have encountered repeated architectural rules: houses facing similar directions, open corridors left free, neighbourhoods positioned in relation to communal buildings, and a central area that remained remarkably open despite the pressure that thousands of structures might otherwise have placed on available land. That open centre deserves attention because 25 hectares is not a small courtyard. It is a large piece of land to leave mostly free inside a settlement where people were evidently capable of building densely when they wanted to. We do not know that one single activity explains the space. Parts of it may have been used for gatherings. Movement, animals, ceremonies, temporary activities, or events that left little archaeological trace. What matters is the decision not to fill it permanently with houses. Empty space in a planned settlement can carry social meaning. It creates room where many people can assemble, establishes distance between residential zones, and gives the community a physical centre that is not simply the home of one unusually important family. If a king had built a palace there, the political interpretation would be rather easy. Instead, archaeologists find a large shared space surrounded by organised housing, which is much more interesting and considerably less cooperative when you're trying to produce a simple explanation. The large communal buildings add to that problem. These structures were significantly larger than ordinary houses and were placed prominently within public areas. Their position suggests that they were not merely oversized private residences. They may have hosted meetings, ceremonies, feasts, storage, exchange, or combinations of activities depending on the needs of the community. If they served clusters of surrounding households, they could have provided a physical location for neighbourhood-level coordination. That would mean Maidanetske did not need one central building where the entire population gathered to settle every matter. Instead, decision-making could have been distributed across several communal places. A dispute over grazing might be handled locally. A larger ceremony could bring several groups together. Questions affecting the entire settlement might require representatives from many neighbourhoods. We cannot prove that exact system from architecture alone, but the spatial pattern makes such layered organisation plausible. Nebelivka provides perhaps the most detailed map of a Trypillia megasite, and therefore gives us another way of seeing the same problem. Modern geophysical survey produced a complete plan of the settlement inside a shallow perimeter ditch, covering approximately 238 hectares. More than 1,200 structures were recognised in early survey reporting, with later project work identifying a total of around 1,445 structures. The settlement included two major concentric circuits of houses, radial streets, smaller groups of buildings, pits, open areas, and unusually large structures interpreted as communal buildings. In the centre was an extraordinary open zone covering roughly 65 hectares, an area large enough to contain many ordinary Trypillia settlements by itself. Nebelivka is especially important because researchers were able to examine not merely individual houses, but the internal structure of the entire settlement plan. Houses could be grouped into what researchers called neighbourhoods, often consisting of only several nearby dwellings, though some groups were larger. More than 150 such neighbourhoods were identified, and many contained between 3 and 7 houses. The average distance between nearby households was small enough that daily interaction would have been easy. That produces a useful correction to the intimidating scale of the overall site. A resident of Nebelivka did not wake up every morning and interact personally with 1,400 households. Daily life probably unfolded among a handful of neighbours, relatives, work partners, and familiar people, while the larger settlement existed as another level of identity above them. This pattern may sound surprisingly familiar. Modern cities are also experienced in pieces. A person can live in a metropolis containing millions of people, while knowing only the residents of one building, one street, a workplace, a few shops, and perhaps the person at the cafe who has already started preparing their order before they reach the counter. Scale becomes manageable because social life is divided into overlapping circles. The Trypillia megasites obviously lacked modern municipal institutions, public transport, apartment blocks, and the minor miracle of getting food delivered to the wrong address. But the basic organisational problem was similar. Large numbers of people cannot function as one face-to-face group. They need smaller units through which everyday obligations can be handled. At Nebelivka, larger communal buildings seem to have provided another level above those neighbourhood groups. Survey identified pairs and individual examples of unusually large structures positioned near the major house circuits, and excavation of one such building supported the interpretation that at least some were public structures used for meetings or ceremonies. Their locations suggest that they acted as focal points for clusters of houses, rather than one monumental centre dominating the whole settlement. Nebelivka contained several places where different groups could gather. This distributed pattern is one reason the megasites are so difficult to fit into the conventional story of early urbanism. Monumental architecture exists, but it is repeated across the settlement rather than concentrated into a single palace or temple district. The central open area at Nebelivka makes the settlement even stranger. Roughly 65 hectares within the middle of the plain contained little evidence for permanent construction or deposition. If maximising residential density had been the goal, leaving that amount of space open would have been an extraordinary waste. The fact that it remained largely unused for houses implies that settlement size cannot be understood simply by dividing the number of buildings by the total area. Nebelivka was large partly because its plan deliberately contained enormous empty spaces. This may have allowed gatherings, grazing, movement, cultivation, temporary structures, or activities we cannot easily detect. It may also have reflected social rules about how settlement space was supposed to be organised. The residents were not trying to pack as many households as possible behind a boundary. They were constructing a landscape with separation built into it. This helps explain another feature that initially seems contradictory. Despite their huge total areas, these megasites were not necessarily dense in the way we imagine ancient cities of stone and mud brick. Research at Nebelivka has estimated a residential density around 6 houses per hectare, meaning significant space existed between the built zones. Talianki may have maintained a comparable overall density. That does not make them small communities. It means the urban scale footprint was created through a combination of extensive housing and deliberate open space. Gardens, animal pens, work areas, paths, and unused zones may have existed between homes and house groups. A person living there could therefore have experienced something halfway between village life and city life, an enormous settlement in overall scale, but a local environment in which houses still had room around them. The population question becomes unavoidable at this point. Thousands of mapped houses once led researchers to estimates of tens of thousands of simultaneous inhabitants at some megasites. That interpretation remains possible in some models, particularly for periods of peak occupation, but newer research has made the situation much less certain. Houses were not necessarily all standing and inhabited at the same time. Radiocarbon dating at Nebelivka suggests the settlement was used over roughly 2 centuries, approximately 3970 to 3770 BCE, and modelling indicates that perhaps only between 1/3 and 1/6 of the total houses were occupied simultaneously under some scenarios. Maidanetske likewise developed through multiple phases rather than appearing fully built in a single prehistoric construction season. Depending on assumptions about how long individual houses were used, population estimates for large Trypillia settlements can shift dramatically, from several thousand people to much larger totals. That uncertainty changes the way we should imagine walking through these places. A modern archaeological plan compresses decades or centuries of construction into one image. It shows every detected house as though someone could have climbed a hill one morning and seen them all standing together. Real occupation may have been far more dynamic. A building in one ring could already have burned while another nearby was newly constructed. One neighbourhood might be expanding while another was declining. Houses could remain as low mounds of burned debris after use, creating visible memories of earlier households inside the living settlement. At Nebelivka, researchers have described some of these burned house remains as forming small, memory mounds, suggesting that the landscape gradually accumulated traces of buildings that were no longer occupied. The result would have been a place containing both active and inactive spaces. Imagine passing a newly built house and then walking by the burned remains of a structure belonging to an earlier household. Farther on, people are repairing a roof, preparing clay, moving cattle, carrying grain, tending an oven, or gathering near a communal building. Another plot may be empty because a house has not yet been constructed there. From the ground, the settlement is changing constantly. even though the final archaeological plan appears fixed. This is why population estimates based simply on house totals can be misleading. Archaeologists are looking at a long exposure photograph of social life rather than one frozen moment. Environmental evidence adds another complication. If tens of thousands of people had lived permanently at Nebelivka for generations, researchers expected to find strong signs of intensive pressure on the surrounding landscape, including major deforestation, increased erosion, and other ecological effects. Yet the environmental proxies examined around the site did not reveal an impact on the scale expected from a permanently concentrated population of that size. This has encouraged interpretations in which fewer people lived there permanently, or in which occupation was periodic or seasonal. Perhaps large numbers gathered only at certain times. Perhaps a smaller resident population maintained the settlement, while others arrived for particular events. Perhaps the pattern changed through the site's history. The evidence does not give us one universally accepted answer, but it makes the old picture of tens of thousands of people permanently occupying every mapped house much harder to sustain without qualification. Maidanetske complicates the seasonal model in its own way because evidence from agriculture, livestock management, kilns and repeated rebuilding shows substantial long-term investment. Whatever the precise population size, these were not temporary camps consisting of a few huts erected for an annual festival and then forgotten. Houses were substantial. Pottery production required infrastructure. Animals were managed across surrounding landscapes. Fields were cultivated. Buildings were intentionally destroyed and replaced. Communities repeatedly invested labour in maintaining a settlement whose scale exceeded what was necessary for ordinary village life. This is why the simplest answer is probably not that megasites were either permanent cities or occasional gathering places. Different areas and different periods may have combined both kinds of activity. The farming territory required to support them must also have been extensive. At Maidanetske, recent work on livestock and pasture organisation has explored how groups may have divided access to grazing land around the settlement. When hundreds of households own animals, pasture becomes a shared problem. Cattle cannot all graze indefinitely beside the nearest houses. Different groups need access to different areas, and those arrangements have to avoid turning every morning into a prehistoric argument over whose herd has eaten whose grass. Researchers have suggested that the spatial organisation of Maidanetske may have been connected with the partitioning of surrounding pasture among different social groups. If so, the internal map of the settlement and the external map of its agricultural territory were parts of the same organisational system. This is an important point because the megasites did not end at their outermost house ring. Their real economic landscape stretched far beyond the inhabited area. Fields, grazing zones, wood sources, clay deposits, routes to water, and connections with smaller settlements all formed part of the system. Talianki's 300+ hectares are impressive, but the land required to sustain the people associated with those houses was much greater. A settlement could only reach this scale if its residents had ways of negotiating access to resources outside it. That negotiation may have involved households, neighbourhoods, kin groups, seasonal agreements, or relationships with nearby communities. Large settlement plans tell us where people built. They do not automatically tell us who controlled the countryside that allowed those buildings to remain occupied. There was also movement between these giant settlements and the smaller places around them. The Trypillia world contains settlements of many sizes, and the largest sites should not be imagined as isolated capitals surrounded by empty territory. Smaller communities continued to exist. People could have moved between them for marriage, exchange, farming, ceremonies, visits, or relocation. Certain megasites may have served as regional gathering points, linking groups whose everyday lives remained partly dispersed across the landscape. If that was the case, the enormous plans become understandable in a different way. The houses were not simply bedrooms for a permanent urban population. They may also have been physical claims of membership, places households returned to, rebuilt, burned, or used during periods when wider groups assembled. The distinction matters when we ask whether Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka should be called cities. In some ways they clearly behaved like urban places. Their scale separated them sharply from ordinary settlements. They organised large populations into neighbourhoods and larger sectors. They contained public or communal architecture, substantial craft activity, regional networks, planned movement routes, and spaces designed for collective use. Researchers studying Nebelivka have argued that a relational understanding of urbanism can justify calling Trypillia megasite cities precisely because they were so different from contemporary settlements around them. Other archaeologists remain more cautious because permanent population density, administrative centralisation, occupational specialisation, and political hierarchy do not appear in the forms familiar from later cities. The word megasite therefore continues to do useful work because it lets us describe what is physically undeniable while leaving the social question open. Seen together, the three settlements also reveal that there was no single blueprint copied without variation. Talianki reached an extraordinary overall size. Maidanetske gives us a particularly clear pattern of concentric rings, broad corridors, a large central space, and communal structures associated with sections of the settlement. Nebelivka offers the most complete geophysical plan and an unusually large open centre, along with neighbourhood groupings and repeated assembly buildings. The differences matter because they show people adapting a common organisational idea rather than following a rigid master plan preserved unchanged across generations. Large-scale settlement had become part of Trypillia social practice, but communities could still adjust the arrangement to local needs. This makes the engineering less mysterious than the social organisation. We can reasonably understand how people built the houses. Timber could be cut locally, clay prepared, walls raised, floors formed, roofs constructed, ovens installed, and pottery produced with technologies already known across the wider cultural tradition. None of those tasks individually required a state. The remarkable achievement was getting thousands of such individual acts to produce a coherent settlement. Every household needed materials, every house needed space, every neighbourhood had to connect with the larger plan. Open corridors had to remain open. Communal buildings required labour beyond one ordinary family. Farming territories had to be shared. Livestock had to be moved without destroying neighbouring crops. Large gatherings needed organisation. New houses had to fit into inherited patterns while older ones were abandoned or burned. A settlement of this scale therefore presents us with an invisible structure hidden behind the visible architecture. Archaeologists can map the houses, but the agreements that made those houses possible have disappeared. We can see a corridor between two rings, but we cannot hear the discussion that kept anyone from building in it. We can excavate a communal structure, but we do not know who had permission to speak there. We can identify neighbourhoods, but we cannot name the families belonging to them. We can estimate how much pasture cattle required, but the rules determining which group used which land survive only indirectly. The buildings are the remains of an organisational system whose most important component was not clay or timber, but cooperation between people. That is where these settlements become more than a curiosity about prehistoric size. Building 2,000 or 3,000 houses is impressive, but building them is not the hardest question. Human beings can mobilise enormous amounts of labour when there is a clear authority forcing or directing them to do so. History gives us plenty of examples. The harder question at the Trypillia megasites is why we struggle to find that authority. There is no obvious royal palace at the centre of Maidanetske, no monumental tomb of the ruler who supposedly commanded Talianki, and no administrative quarter at Nebelivka, where a permanent bureaucracy appears to have managed the population. Instead, the settlements look divided into repeating social units, with multiple communal buildings distributed across the plan. The physical evidence keeps pointing back toward organisation that may have operated horizontally between groups as much as vertically from leaders above them. Once we recognise that possibility, the scale of Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka becomes even more remarkable. Perhaps the most important thing about these places was not simply that prehistoric Europeans could gather thousands of people together. It was that they may have found ways of doing so without creating the kind of centralized political machinery that appears so clearly in many later cities. That does not mean leadership was absent, and it certainly does not mean everyone agreed pleasantly about everything. A settlement containing thousands of people has probably never existed without someone being irritated about somebody else. What it does mean is that authority may have been temporary, distributed, negotiated, or divided between households, neighbourhoods, communal institutions, and larger gatherings. To understand how that could work, we have to move away from the impressive size of the sites for a moment and look at the social machinery behind them, because the next problem is not how prehistoric people constructed a settlement 300 hectares wide, but how they persuaded enough separate households to keep it functioning when there was no obvious king standing in the middle telling everyone what to do. Once a settlement reaches the scale of Maidanetske or Talianki, the question of construction almost becomes secondary. The inhabitants clearly knew how to build houses, fire pottery, cultivate fields, raise livestock, and organise labour. Those skills had existed in the Cucuteni Trypillia world for centuries. The harder problem is social. How do thousands of people agree on where houses should stand, which spaces should remain open, how grazing land should be divided, where communal buildings should be placed, and what happens when the interests of one group conflict with those of another? In many later ancient societies, we would expect to find a fairly obvious answer. There would be a palace, a ruler, a temple administration, an elite quarter, a bureaucracy, or some combination of all of them. Someone would be collecting grain, assigning labour, keeping records, and making decisions on behalf of everyone else. At the Trypillia megasites, that familiar machinery is remarkably difficult to see. Instead, archaeologists keep encountering evidence for organisation distributed across households, neighbourhoods, larger residential groups, communal buildings, and shared landscapes. The emerging picture is not a society without authority, because a community containing thousands of people could hardly function without rules and decision-making. It is a society in which authority may have been divided among many groups rather than permanently concentrated in the hands of a king. That distinction is important because large settlements are often treated as though they naturally produce centralised government. Put enough people together, the argument goes, and eventually someone needs to take charge. Food must be organised, disputes settled, public works coordinated, and resources allocated. From there, it seems like a short step to chiefs, administrators, taxes, guards, and rulers. The Trypillia megasites make that progression look much less automatic. Research on the spatial organisation of settlements such as Maidanetske and Nebelivka points toward what archaeologists often describe as heterarchical organisation, meaning that social coordination may have operated through several overlapping groups without one permanent hierarchy dominating all of them. At Maidanetske, large buildings interpreted as communal or assembly structures were associated with clusters of roughly 50 to 150 dwellings, while the settlement itself was divided into repeated residential groupings separated by substantial open spaces. That layout suggests that different portions of the community may have had their own places for meetings and collective activity, rather than depending entirely on one central institution. Imagine the problem from the level of an ordinary household. You live with relatives in one house, among a small group of neighbouring houses. Those people are likely the ones you interact with most often. You share paths, work nearby land, exchange food or labour, watch one another's children, borrow tools, argue about animals, and probably know far more about one another's affairs than anyone strictly needs to. Several of these small household clusters could form a larger neighbourhood. That neighbourhood might share a communal building or participate together in ceremonies, feasts, craft activities, or negotiations over resources. Several neighbourhoods could then belong to a larger quarter of the settlement. By organising society in layers, people could keep daily relationships small enough to remain manageable, while still participating in a community containing thousands of residents. No one needed to know every household personally. They needed dependable connections between groups. Modern governments often solve this problem by creating offices and representatives. Prehistoric communities obviously use different institutions, but representation itself does not require writing. A household can choose an elder or respected member to speak for it. A group of houses can send people to a wider meeting. Certain individuals can become influential because of experience, family connections, ritual knowledge, skill at negotiation, or the simple ability to sit through a long disagreement without becoming impossible to deal with. Leadership can also be temporary. Someone who organises a communal building project does not automatically control livestock. A skilled ritual specialist may not decide where crops are planted. A person trusted to negotiate with another settlement may have little authority over how a neighbourhood distributes food. Instead of one ruler accumulating every form of power, responsibilities can remain divided. The communal structures identified at Trypillia megasites fit surprisingly well with this possibility. At settlements such as Maidanetske and Nebelivka, archaeologists have found unusually large buildings positioned separately from ordinary houses and often associated with larger residential units. Some researchers refer to them as assembly houses because their size and placement suggest that they could have hosted gatherings larger than a normal household. The term should not make us imagine a modern council chamber, with someone formally calling the meeting to order. We do not know precisely what took place inside these buildings. They may have been used for ceremonies, feasting, redistribution, discussion, storage, craft activities, or several purposes depending on the occasion. What matters is that they appear to have served groups beyond the household. At some sites, researchers have argued for a hierarchy of communal buildings, with smaller gathering structures serving neighbourhoods or quarters, and larger ones potentially serving wider sections of the settlement. That arrangement would have allowed decision-making to move through several levels. A small issue might never leave the neighbourhood. A disagreement over a local work area could be handled by people who actually used it. A question about pasture shared by several groups might require a broader meeting. A matter affecting the whole settlement could bring representatives from multiple quarters together. This would be slower than simply waiting for a king to announce the answer, but it would also spread political participation more widely. Anyone who has attended a modern committee meeting may reasonably wonder whether this was progress, but for communities trying to prevent one household or lineage from dominating everyone else, distributed decision-making could have been extremely useful. Recent research has given this idea another intriguing line of support. A 2024 study examined differences in house sizes across thousands of Trypillia dwellings from dozens of settlements, using variation in residential space as one possible indicator of household inequality. The authors found that during the development of the megasites, differences between household sizes appear to have decreased rather than increased. In other words, as some Trypillia communities became much larger and socially more complicated, household inequality may temporarily have become less pronounced. The researchers interpret this as evidence that megasite communities developed mechanisms that reduced disparities and allowed wider participation in political life. Later, those differences began increasing again, and the authors suggest that renewed social differentiation may have contributed to the eventual weakening of the megasite system. That does not mean every household possessed exactly the same wealth, nor can house size provide a complete measurement of prehistoric status. But the pattern challenges the idea that aggregation automatically produced a wealthy ruling class, living in enormous residences, while everyone else crowded into smaller homes. There are several ways a community might limit the growth of inequality without anything resembling modern legislation. Social expectations can discourage excessive accumulation. Surplus can be redistributed through feasting. Livestock may be managed cooperatively. Important resources can be treated as belonging to groups rather than individuals. Households can be expected to contribute labour to communal projects, and receive support in return. Prestige may come from generosity rather than permanent possession, encouraging successful families to give food or goods away instead of storing everything for themselves. None of these mechanisms requires everyone to have identical possessions. They simply prevent differences from becoming so large that one small group can permanently control everybody else. The layout of the settlements may itself have helped reinforce that balance. Trypillia houses were often similar enough in general form that the built environment did not display extreme differences between ordinary households. There is no obvious central palace occupying 10 times the space of surrounding residences. Large structures exist, but they appear to have been communal rather than private elite mansions. If important gatherings took place in buildings used by groups rather than in the residence of one ruler, authority would have been tied to collective spaces rather than an individual's household. Architecture can influence politics in quiet ways. Put the largest building in the possession of one family, and everyone understands something about power. Make the largest building a shared meeting place, and the message is quite different. The open spaces between house rings may have worked in a similar way. They were not merely unused land. At Maidanetske, broad areas between residential circuits may have provided room for communal movement and activities, while larger assembly structures stood within these zones. A neighbourhood therefore existed as part of a wider social landscape, rather than as a collection of houses packed against one another. People could gather outside private domestic space, which matters because meetings held inside one household's home immediately give that household a special position. Shared spaces create neutral territory. We cannot know whether the residents consciously thought about them that way, but the repeated preservation of large public areas suggests that collective access mattered. Resources beyond the settlement created more difficult problems because fields and animals cannot be managed by architecture alone. Cattle require pasture, and good pasture close to a huge settlement is finite. Sheep and goats can range farther, but someone still has to decide where they go. Crops require land that cannot simultaneously be used by every household. Water points, wooded areas, clay sources, and routes through the landscape all have limits. Recent isotopic research on animal remains from Maidanetske provides a glimpse of how carefully these resources may have been organised. The evidence suggests that residents used both intensive and extensive grazing systems. Some valuable cattle, probably including dairy animals, were kept on high-quality pasture closer to the settlement, while other livestock range more widely across different parts of the surrounding landscape. The researchers argue that access to these grazing areas would have required negotiation among households or larger social groups, and may have helped bind the community together through repeated cooperation. This is one of those details that turns an abstract archaeological settlement plan back into daily life. Imagine two neighbouring groups both owning cattle. The best pasture near the settlement cannot support every animal indefinitely. If one group takes too much, another loses access. Perhaps different areas are allocated to different groups. Perhaps grazing rights rotate. Perhaps some herds are combined. Perhaps households contribute animals to a larger jointly managed herd. However the system worked, everyone needed to know the rules. Those rules had to be remembered, defended, renegotiated, and probably complained about. A community does not need writing to create land rights. Human beings were arguing over access to useful land long before anyone invented paperwork. The same principle could apply to agricultural fields. Household-level farming may have existed alongside communal arrangements for manure, pasture, or labour. Cattle kept close to the settlement produced dung that could be used as fertiliser, turning livestock management into part of crop production. If groups cooperated in maintaining cattle and pasture, the benefits could be distributed across agricultural households as well. The result would be an economy in which households remained important producers but could not function completely independently. Cooperation was not simply a pleasant cultural preference. It was embedded in the practical requirements of supporting a large settlement. That may explain why the megasites could grow without immediately producing a centralized state. If the essential unit remained the household, but households were nested inside neighborhoods, quarters, and wider communal institutions, many tasks could be solved locally. A palace administration becomes particularly useful when one central authority needs to collect and redistribute resources across a territory. The Trypillia system may instead have distributed those responsibilities. A neighborhood could manage some food production. Another group could operate a pottery kiln. Several households might cooperate over cattle. Communal buildings could host decisions. Larger gatherings could deal with problems affecting several sectors. Rather than creating one bureaucracy responsible for everything, the settlement could function through overlapping networks of obligation. Craft production provides another example. Archaeological evidence suggests that pottery workshops occurred in different parts of Trypillia megasites, including within or near residential groupings. Production therefore did not necessarily need to be concentrated under the control of one central workshop. Different neighbourhoods could contain skilled producers supplying local needs or exchanging vessels with others. The same principle may have applied to certain tools and other specialised activities. Skill could become concentrated without becoming politically centralised. A particularly talented potter might have been highly valued, but there is no reason to assume that this person therefore controlled land, cattle, communal ceremonies, and political decisions. Even construction itself could have worked through cooperative groups. Building a Trypillia house required considerable labour, but not necessarily thousands of workers. A household supported by relatives and neighbours could gather timber, prepare clay, raise walls, and complete a building without needing settlement-wide administration. A communal assembly structure would require more labour, but if dozens of households contributed workers and materials, the project could still be achieved through temporary coordination. This is how many societies without centralised states have historically built surprisingly large structures. Not by maintaining a permanent labour bureaucracy, but by mobilising people when necessary through kinship, obligation, feasting, ritual, and reciprocal assistance. Reciprocity is especially important because cooperative labour works best when people expect support to be returned. Your neighbours help build your house because their household will eventually need help as well. Your group contributes cattle to a shared feast because another group contributed at the previous gathering. You provide grain during a difficult year because relationships matter more than maximising one season's private store. These arrangements create what might look from the outside like generosity, but they can also be highly practical systems of insurance. Farming is risky. A household that suffers a poor harvest survives more easily if it belongs to a network of people willing or obligated to share resources. In a very large settlement, maintaining those networks at several levels could make aggregation attractive rather than simply burdensome. This may help explain why people came together in megasites in the first place. Large settlements create problems, but they also create opportunities. More people mean larger marriage networks, more potential labour partners, more exchange, more specialised skills, more protection against isolated economic failure, and larger ceremonies or gatherings that reinforce shared identity. A household living in a small settlement might have fewer people available when illness or crop failure strikes. Inside a megasite, membership in a neighbourhood and wider community could provide access to support beyond close relatives. One reason these settlements grew may therefore have been that collective life offered real advantages, provided the political system prevented powerful households from capturing too much of those benefits. There was also the issue of conflict. A society without kings is not a society without disagreement. In fact, distributed systems can require more negotiation precisely because there is no final authority capable of ending an argument by command. Households could disagree over pasture, exchange obligations, marriages, construction space, access to communal facilities, or countless personal grievances that leave no archaeological evidence. Some method of mediation must have existed. Respected individuals, elders, kin groups, assemblies, Ritual specialists or temporary councils may have played that role. The repeated presence of communal buildings provides a plausible setting for such negotiations, although we cannot know whether an excavation trench has uncovered the prehistoric equivalent of a council hall, feast house, ritual building, or all three at different moments. Feasting may have been especially important because food can turn politics into a social event. A large communal meal brings groups together, allows surplus to be redistributed, creates opportunities for negotiation, and gives influential households a way to earn prestige by contributing rather than simply accumulating. Alcoholic drinks may also have existed, which throughout human history have had the admirable ability to make gatherings both more sociable and potentially much less efficient. Large painted vessels, animal remains, communal buildings, and open spaces all fit comfortably within a world where gatherings involved eating and drinking, although we should avoid pretending we can reconstruct a specific ceremony from scattered remains. Ritual could have helped reinforce cooperation as well. Shared beliefs create obligations extending beyond economic convenience. If different neighbourhoods participated in the same ceremonies, burned houses according to related traditions, used similar symbolic objects, and followed common ideas about settlement space, then living together was not simply a practical arrangement. It was part of a shared social identity. People could see themselves as members of households, neighbourhoods, local groups, and the larger settlement simultaneously. The concentric layout may have made those relationships physically visible. You knew where your house belonged because it stood within a repeated pattern, also followed by everyone else. This makes the absence of kings easier to understand. Order does not always need to be imposed from above if enough of it has already been built into custom. When everyone knows how houses should be arranged, where certain gatherings take place, which groups control particular pasture, how communal labour is organised, and what obligations accompany membership, society can coordinate itself through expectations learned from childhood. Breaking those expectations has consequences because neighbours, relatives, and wider groups all have an interest in maintaining them. Law does not begin with writing. Long before legal codes were carved into stone, human communities had rules concerning property, marriage, violence, exchange, inheritance, obligation, and behaviour. The Trypillia megasites must have had such rules simply to exist, even though not one sentence of them survives. There may still have been prominent leaders. It would be unrealistic to imagine several thousand people making every decision through perfect consensus. Some individuals were almost certainly better connected, more persuasive, wealthier in livestock, more experienced, or associated with important traditions. The key issue is whether those advantages became permanent institutions of domination. During the height of the megasite phenomenon, the available evidence gives relatively little sign of a ruling class separating itself dramatically from ordinary households. The 2024 analysis of house size inequality is particularly important here because it suggests that aggregation may initially have gone together with social levelling. The authors argue that mechanisms of reconciliation, redistribution, and participation may have made megasites attractive to people precisely because they limited severe household inequality. If that interpretation is correct, the Trypillia experiment becomes much more interesting than a story about cities that simply had not invented kings yet. These communities may have been actively maintaining institutions that prevented strong hierarchy from developing. Smaller communal buildings allowed participation at local levels. Larger assembly structures linked broader sections of the settlement. House sizes remained relatively balanced. Resources such as pasture required constant negotiation. Production was dispersed through neighbourhoods. None of this proves an egalitarian political philosophy in the modern sense, but it does suggest that social balance required work. And maintaining balance becomes harder as a community grows. A system that functions among a few hundred people may struggle when thousands are involved. Representatives gain influence because they spend more time making decisions. Families involved in long-distance exchange may gain access to valuable goods. Specialists may become difficult to replace. Some households accumulate more animals. Certain communal buildings become more important than others. Temporary leadership can gradually become permanent. Once one group controls enough resources or enough connections, the mechanisms that previously prevented inequality may begin to weaken. Researchers studying Trypillia communal architecture have suggested that this may be visible in changes through time. Earlier phases of some megasites contained assembly buildings operating at multiple levels, allowing neighbourhoods, quarters, and wider settlement groups to participate in collective decisions. Later, some smaller assembly structures disappeared, potentially concentrating decision-making in fewer places and among fewer people. Combined with increasing differences in house size, this raises the possibility that the political system gradually became less inclusive. That does not mean a king suddenly appeared. Political change is rarely that convenient. More likely, social influence became uneven in subtler ways. Some groups may have gained stronger control over gatherings, exchange networks, productive resources, or communal institutions. Others may have felt increasingly excluded from decisions. A large settlement depends on cooperation because households can always decide that the benefits of remaining together are no longer worth the costs. Without walls, armies, or state officials forcing people to stay, the megasite had to remain attractive. If the system stopped distributing advantages widely enough, leaving became a genuine political option. That possibility gives us a different way to think about the power of ordinary households. In a centralized state, rulers can often maintain cities through taxation, coercion, military force, or administrative control over land. In the Trypillia world, people may have had much greater freedom to relocate. Families knew how to build houses. Farming land existed elsewhere. Smaller settlements remained part of the wide landscape. If a neighbourhood became dissatisfied, its members did not necessarily need to overthrow a government. They could move. A political system based on voluntary aggregation therefore had to keep persuading people to participate. Perhaps that is the most surprising answer to the question of how a megacity could exist without kings. It did not function because nobody was in charge. It functioned because being in charge may have been divided into many smaller responsibilities. Households managed domestic production. Neighbourhood groups handled local cooperation. Communal buildings provided settings for wider decisions. Pasture and livestock required negotiation between groups. Larger assemblies may have coordinated matters affecting entire settlements. Traditions regulated settlement plans and house construction. Shared rituals reinforced common identities. Social mechanisms limited the ability of individual households to become overwhelmingly dominant, at least for part of the megasite period. The system was complicated, but complexity and hierarchy are not the same thing. What this looked like on an ordinary morning is much harder to see from a geophysical map. Political organisation only becomes meaningful when it reaches food, work, animals, tools, and household routines. Someone still had to get up and feed cattle. Grain still had to be processed. Ovens needed fuel. Clay had to be collected. Pottery had to be shaped and fired. Fields required attention. Children learned skills by watching adults. Goods moved between neighbourhoods and between settlements. Communal decisions mattered because they affected these very ordinary activities, and the enormous social experiment of the Trypillia megasites could only continue as long as thousands of individual households were able to make daily life work inside it. That takes us away from the meeting places and into the houses, workshops, fields, and exchange routes themselves, where the question is no longer who governed these enormous communities, but what it was actually like to live in one. Once we move away from the enormous settlement plans and step inside the rings, the Trypillia megasites become much easier to understand as places where ordinary people actually lived. From a distance, a site such as Maidanetske looks almost mathematical, with repeated rows of houses curving around broad open spaces. On the ground, however, nobody experienced it as a diagram. People woke inside houses that needed repair, prepared food, carried water, tended animals, worked fields, shaped clay, sharpened stone tools, looked after children, visited neighbours, and dealt with the familiar problem of having more work available than daylight in which to finish it. Whatever political arrangements allowed the megasites to function, they ultimately depended on thousands of domestic routines being repeated every day. A settlement covering 200 hectares could have impressive assembly buildings and carefully organised neighbourhoods, but none of that mattered for very long if grain ran out. Cattle became unhealthy, roofs failed, or nobody remembered to collect enough firewood before winter. The house was the centre of much of this activity. Trypillia buildings were rectangular structures constructed mainly from timber, clay-rich materials, and other resources taken from the surrounding landscape. Many were substantial by prehistoric European standards. Archaeological reconstruction and experimental work at Nebelivka suggest that an average house around 15 metres long and 5 metres wide could require a team of roughly 10 to 12 people working for about a month, with larger structures demanding considerably more labour. Some buildings may have had 2 levels or raised internal platforms, although reconstructing the exact appearance of every house remains difficult, because the structures survive mainly through collapsed and burned material. What is clear is that building one required planning. Timber had to be cut and transported, clay collected and mixed, structural frames raised, walls prepared, floors finished, and roofing installed. A household might provide part of that labour itself, but completing a building efficiently would have been much easier with assistance from relatives and neighbours, which turned house construction into another reason for maintaining good relationships with the people living nearby. Inside, domestic life probably combined activities that a modern household would spread across several separate rooms and buildings. Food was stored and prepared there. Ovens or hearths provided heat and allowed cooking. Tools were kept and repaired. Clay objects could be worked. Textiles or fibres may have been processed. People slept there, talked there, argued there, and spent considerable time doing jobs that leave very little dramatic archaeological evidence. A prehistoric household did not divide the day neatly into employment and leisure. Production happened inside and around the home. If grain needed processing, someone processed it. If an animal's skin needed working, someone did that. If a broken vessel could not be repaired, another had to be obtained. The household was simultaneously a residence, workshop, storehouse, kitchen and social unit, which at least meant the commute to work was excellent. The immediate neighbourhood would have mattered almost as much as the house itself. At Nebelivka, groups of nearby dwellings formed small neighbourhood units, while Maidanetske contained larger clusters associated with communal structures. This meant that although the entire settlement could contain an intimidating number of buildings, everyday experience remained relatively local. A person might recognise hundreds or thousands of other residents as members of the wider settlement without interacting closely with most of them. The people who mattered every morning were more likely to be the households next door, relatives, work partners, and those using the same paths, grazing arrangements, kilns, or gathering places. That pattern makes practical sense. A community can become very large only if some parts of social life remain small. Households also needed food, and this is where the scale of the megasites becomes a very practical problem. Cucuteni Trypillia communities were farmers who cultivated cereals and kept domestic animals, supplemented by other plant and animal resources. Agriculture was not something taking place in a distant countryside unrelated to the settlement. It determined the rhythm of life inside it. Fields had to be prepared, crops planted and harvested, grain transported, processed and stored. A poor harvest affected what went into cooking pots months later. Livestock required daily attention, whether anyone felt enthusiastic about it or not. Large settlements therefore depended on enormous amounts of labour taking place beyond the visible rings of houses. Cattle were particularly important. They provided meat, but their value went considerably farther. Cows could supply milk and dairy products, while cattle also represented stored wealth, breeding potential, manure, and in some circumstances traction. Ceramic models associated with the wider Cucuteni Trypillia world depict wheeled vehicles and ox-drawn transport, showing that communities understood the usefulness of animal power. Keeping cattle close to a megasite, however, created a basic problem. Cattle eat a great deal of grass. Once hundreds of households are maintaining animals, the land immediately around the settlement can no longer be treated as an unlimited communal lawn. Research at Maidanetske has used chemical signatures preserved in animal bones to investigate how livestock were managed. The results indicate that residents used different pasturing strategies. Some cattle appear to have been kept on more intensively managed, high-quality grazing grounds, probably relatively close to the settlement, while other animals ranged over different and more extensive areas. Dairy cattle would have benefited from especially productive pasture, because animals providing milk require reliable nutrition, while other herds could be moved farther away. Researchers have argued that organising these different pasture zones would have required negotiation between social groups within Maidanetske. In other words, cattle management was not simply a household matter. The landscape surrounding the settlement may have been divided or coordinated in ways that reflected the neighbourhoods and larger groups living inside it. That turns a fairly ordinary activity into evidence for how the whole community functioned. Imagine several neighbourhoods whose animals need access to the same productive grassland. If everyone sends cattle into the nearest pasture whenever they like, the system works beautifully for approximately 5 minutes. After that, grazing pressure increases, animals compete for forage, and households begin objecting to what everyone else's cattle are doing. Some arrangement becomes necessary. Different groups could use different zones. Access might rotate through the year. Certain animals might receive priority. Herds might be combined. We cannot reconstruct the exact rules, but there had to be rules of some kind. The impressive organisation visible inside Maidanetske therefore probably continued outside the settlement into fields and pasture. Crop farming created similar demands. Grain production required significant areas of land, and those fields could not simply begin beyond the last house and continue indefinitely without affecting other resources. People needed woodland for construction and fuel. Animals required grazing. Wild plants and animals remained useful. Paths connected the megasite with smaller settlements and resource zones. Clay had to be collected for houses and pottery. Water needed to remain accessible. The economic territory of a megasite was therefore much larger than its mapped residential area. When archaeologists describe Maidanetske as covering around 200 hectares, that tells us where the settlement structures were concentrated. It does not tell us how much surrounding countryside was involved in keeping its households alive. Food storage would have helped manage the seasonal nature of this system. A cereal harvest arrives during a limited part of the year, while people would prefer to continue eating throughout the rest of it. Grain therefore had to be dried sufficiently, protected from moisture and pests, and stored until required. Seeds for the next planting also needed protection. Other foods could be preserved, processed, or consumed according to season. Livestock offered another way of spreading food resources across the year because animals effectively convert pasture and agricultural byproducts into meat and dairy products. The household economy was therefore based on balancing several resources rather than depending on one crop. Cooking transformed those resources into daily meals, and pottery was central to the process. Cucuteni Trypillia ceramics are among the most recognisable objects produced by these communities. Many vessels were carefully shaped and decorated with painted designs, including spirals, curves, bands, and geometric arrangements. Their appearance is striking enough that modern discussions sometimes focus almost entirely on the decoration, but the people using them did not live inside an archaeological exhibition. Pots had jobs. They stored food, held liquids, carried ingredients, supported cooking and serving, and eventually broke. Some finely decorated vessels may have been associated with particular meals, ceremonies, or social occasions, while more ordinary wares handled routine work. The difference between a beautiful vessel and a practical one was not necessarily absolute. A prehistoric family was perfectly capable of wanting the container holding dinner to look nice. Producing pottery well required specialised knowledge. Suitable clay had to be found, collected, cleaned and mixed. The potter needed to understand how wet the material should be, how walls could be shaped without collapsing, how surfaces should be finished, when decoration could be applied, how long the vessel needed to dry, and what temperatures were required during firing. A badly prepared pot might crack before reaching the kiln. A poorly controlled firing could ruin hours of work. Experience mattered, and by the period of the large Trypillia settlements, pottery production had become increasingly specialised. UNESCO's archaeological summary of the Ukrainian Cucuteni Trypillia sites notes the development of sophisticated multi-channel kilns and specialised pottery manufacture before and during the emergence of the great settlements. At Maidanetske, pottery workshops were distributed through different neighbourhoods, rather than concentrated into one central industrial area. This is an important detail because it fits the broader pattern we have already seen in political organisation. Specialised production existed, but specialisation did not automatically mean centralisation. A skilled group of potters could serve a neighbourhood or several nearby groups without working for a palace or state administration. Archaeologists examining Maidanetske have specifically noted that many neighbourhoods contained pottery workshops, suggesting production directed at local or neighbourhood consumption. That would have created an interesting economic arrangement. Not every household needed to be equally skilled at every activity. One family might have experienced potters. Another could have particular knowledge of stoneworking. Some people might be especially useful builders. Others could manage animals effectively, organise exchange, work bone, or make figurines. Research at Nebelivka has described these kinds of skilled producers as limited interest groups, including builders, potters, flint knappers, bone tool makers, and figurine makers. Such groups do not necessarily look like full-time professions in the modern sense. A skilled potter could still farm, a builder could still keep livestock. Specialisation existed along a spectrum, with some people becoming particularly competent at tasks that other households preferred to obtain through exchange or cooperative relationships. The same is true of flint. Stone remained essential even in a society that knew copper. Good flint could be shaped into blades, points, scrapers, and other tools with cutting edges that were extremely effective. High-quality deposits occurred in particular places rather than evenly across the landscape, so obtaining the best material required exchange networks. The Cucuteni Trypillia world included specialised exploitation of flint sources, and finished or partially worked material could travel hundreds of kilometres. UNESCO's documentation describes flint processing as an increasingly developed craft with broad distribution networks, while other raw materials, including obsidian, copper, silver, gold and salt, moved through wider systems of interaction, connecting Trypillia communities with neighbouring cultural groups. This movement of materials is worth pausing over because long-distance exchange did not require coinage, formal markets, or merchants carrying price lists. Goods can travel great distances through repeated exchanges. A piece of flint may move from one community to another, then onward through marriage connections, gifts, trading partnerships, seasonal gatherings, or visits. People did not need to understand the entire network for the material to cross it. Someone at Maidanetske could possess an object made from a resource originating far away, without ever meeting the person who first extracted it. Some goods travelled because they were practical, while others probably carried prestige or social meaning. Copper and decorative materials could signal connections beyond the local region. Unusual vessels or ornaments might become important because they came from elsewhere. At Nebelivka, pottery associated with the burning of the largest assembly structure included vessels made from varying fabrics, suggesting contributions from multiple households or neighbourhoods. One vessel has been interpreted as an import from the Megacities cultural region of the lower Danube. The assemblage therefore provides a small but useful reminder that even a giant Trypillia settlement was part of a world extending well beyond its own rings. Salt may have been one of the least glamorous but most valuable commodities moving through these networks. Cucuteni Trypillia communities exploited mineral-rich salt springs in what is now Romania, where brine could be processed to produce concentrated salt. UNESCO's recent documentation describes the production of standardized salt briquettes intended for long-distance exchange. Salt mattered for diet, food preservation, animal management and other practical uses, making reliable sources economically important. A polished copper ornament may look more impressive in a display case, but anyone who has spent several months trying to preserve food would probably develop considerable respect for the person arriving with salt. Trade should not be imagined as a separate activity occurring only when professional traders arrived. Exchange was woven into social relationships. A household could give pottery to relatives, receive flint from visitors, contribute food to a feast, exchange animals during marriage arrangements, or participate in gatherings where several kinds of material changed hands. A larger settlement increased the number of possible connections. With hundreds of households present, someone looking for a skilled potter, a breeding animal, a stoneworker, a marriage partner, or information from another region had many more options than someone living in an isolated farmstead. That may have been one of the strongest attractions of megasite life. Large communities were expensive to maintain, but concentration brought opportunity. If your household suffered a poor harvest, wider social connections could provide support. If you needed labour for construction, more people were available. If you wanted a particular craft product, someone nearby might know how to make it. If livestock needed exchanging to avoid maintaining the same breeding stock indefinitely, a large settlement offered a broader network. If young adults needed partners outside their closest relatives, gathering populations together made those connections much easier. The megasite was therefore not merely a place where people consumed resources. It increased the number of relationships through which resources, labour, knowledge and people could move. Communal meals probably strengthened some of those relationships. Large assembly buildings and open spaces provide obvious locations where groups could gather, and archaeological finds show that collective consumption could occur on a substantial scale. At Nebelivka, the burning of the enormous megastructure involved the deposition of more than 60 kilograms of pottery representing at least several hundred vessels, many associated with communal consumption. Researchers have interpreted the varied vessel fabrics as evidence that different households or neighbourhoods contributed pottery to the event. Whatever exactly happened there, people were not simply attending as passive spectators. Multiple groups appear to have brought material into a shared setting. A gathering like that could perform several jobs at once. People could eat, exchange goods, arrange relationships, reinforce membership, settle disputes, conduct ritual activities, and make collective decisions. Food makes an excellent political tool because sharing it turns an abstract agreement into something physical. A household contributes grain, meat, drink, or pottery and demonstrates its commitment to the group. Others do the same. Generosity creates reputation. Participation creates obligation. People who may spend most of the year working within their own neighbourhood are reminded that they belong to something larger. The meal ends, everyone goes home, and the next morning the cattle still need attention, but the wider social connections have been renewed. Children growing up inside these settlements would have learned the system gradually rather than receiving formal instruction about how megasite society worked. They would learn which paths led to relatives, which open spaces were used for particular gatherings, how fields were worked, which animals belonged to which household, how clay was prepared, and when certain tasks needed to happen. They would watch adults exchange goods, help neighbours, participate in ceremonies, and respond when houses were burned or rebuilt. Cultural knowledge was maintained through repeated action. A settlement plan that looks like sophisticated design to us may have felt obvious to someone who had grown up seeing houses arranged that way all their life. The seasons would have changed the atmosphere considerably. Planting and harvest created intense agricultural workloads. Livestock routines shifted according to pasture and weather. Winter increased the importance of stored food and fuel. Construction work may have been easier during certain parts of the year. Gatherings could have followed agricultural or ceremonial cycles. If some megasites were occupied partly by people arriving seasonally from surrounding communities, the population itself may have changed dramatically at different times. A settlement that felt spacious and relatively quiet during one period could become crowded during a major gathering. This possibility also explains why archaeologists remain cautious about reconstructing a single version of everyday life. We do not know that every Trypillia megasite was occupied in exactly the same way. Nebelivka may not have functioned identically to Maidanetske. Population could change through the lifetime of one settlement. Some neighbourhoods might remain occupied more continuously than others. Houses could be built and burned at different times. People could maintain links with smaller settlements elsewhere. The rings were not a static stage on which one unchanging lifestyle continued for centuries. Environmental evidence from Nebelivka has made this especially important. Researchers did not find the level of deforestation, erosion, cereal pollen or other landscape impact that would be expected if an extremely large permanent population had occupied the entire site continuously. That has supported models involving smaller simultaneous populations, seasonal aggregation, or other forms of less intensive occupation. Yet substantial houses, assembly structures, craft production, repeated burning, and long-term planning show that these places were far more than temporary camps. The inhabitants invested heavily in them, even if they did not all remain there year-round. This leaves us with a form of everyday life that does not fit comfortably into the categories we usually use. People lived in houses that looked broadly similar to those of smaller farming communities, but those houses stood inside settlements hundreds of hectares wide. They farmed and kept livestock, yet doing so required coordination across large social groups. They made pottery locally, but some production was specialised and organised through neighbourhoods. They relied heavily on stone tools while participating in exchange networks, carrying materials across hundreds of kilometres. They gathered in large communal buildings but left no palace administration behind. Their economy was domestic without being isolated, specialised without becoming fully centralised, and agricultural while supporting settlements larger than almost anything else in contemporary Europe. If you had spent a day at Maidanetske, much of what you saw might not have looked especially urban. You would have seen animals, grain, clay, timber, smoke, ovens, houses, people carrying things, children learning tasks, and neighbours working together. Walk far enough, however, and the houses would keep going. Pass one neighbourhood and another would appear. Cross an open corridor and another ring of buildings would begin. Somewhere pottery kilns would be operating. Elsewhere, cattle would be returning from pasture. People from different groups would move toward an assembly structure. Goods arriving from distant regions could sit beside objects made from local clay. The individual activities were familiar features of farming life, but their concentration and coordination produced something with no obvious equivalent elsewhere in Europe at the time. That is why the debate over what to call these places cannot be settled by size alone. Daily life inside the rings contained many features we associate with villages: household farming, local neighbourhoods, livestock, domestic craft work, and close relationships between nearby families. At the same time, the settlements contained specialised production, planned public space, large communal architecture, regional exchange networks, thousands of house structures, and systems capable of coordinating resources across an enormous area. Depending on which features we decide matter most, Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka can look like oversized villages, seasonal gathering centres, proto-urban settlements, low-density cities, or something that our usual archaeological categories were never designed to describe. To decide whether Europe really had cities more than 1,000 years before the pyramids, we have to stop asking only how large these settlements were and deal with the much more difficult question of what a city actually is. The moment we ask whether Talianki, Maidanetske, Nebelivka, and the other Trypillia megasites were cities, a problem appears that has very little to do with prehistoric Europe and quite a lot to do with us. We tend to think we know what a city is because we live with cities, travel through them, see them on maps, and recognise the familiar ingredients almost immediately. There are streets, neighbourhoods, public buildings, markets, workplaces, transport routes, administrative institutions, and large numbers of people who mostly do not know one another personally. When archaeologists move backward into the ancient world, however, those familiar features begin to separate. One settlement may have thousands of inhabitants but little obvious hierarchy. Another may have a palace and specialised crafts but a relatively modest population. A third may cover an enormous area while remaining surprisingly low in residential density. The Trypillia megasites combine enough urban features to look extraordinary while lacking several characteristics that were once considered essential to a true city. That is why calling them Europe's first cities is both defensible and controversial. Some researchers argue that they represent an independent form of early urbanism, perhaps the earliest low-density urban settlements currently known, while others prefer terms such as megasite, proto-town, or aggregation settlement because questions about permanent population and centralised institutions remain unresolved. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists understood early cities largely through examples from Mesopotamia and Egypt. That made sense because those regions produced some of the most visible early urban societies in the archaeological record. Mesopotamian settlements such as Uruk developed dense populations, monumental architecture, specialised production, long-distance exchange, administrative systems, and eventually writing. Egypt produced political centralisation on an even larger territorial scale, along with temples, royal institutions, officials, monumental tombs, and a state capable of directing enormous amounts of labour. If those societies become the standard model, an early city begins to look like a package. You expect dense settlement, permanent occupation, economic specialisation, hierarchy, administration, public architecture, regional control, and eventually institutions powerful enough to separate rulers from ordinary households. Trypillia communities create difficulties because they seem to have opened the package, kept some items, and left several others on the table. Size is the most obvious urban feature. A settlement covering 200 or 300 hectares cannot comfortably be described as an ordinary farming village. Talianki reached around 340 hectares in some estimates, while Maidanetske covered roughly 200 and Nebelivka around 238 to 260, depending on how its boundaries are defined. These were among the largest known settlements in 4th millennium BCE Europe, and researchers have described Trypillia megasites more broadly as the largest sites of their period in Eurasia and possibly the world. Their layouts also demonstrate planning on a scale that smaller villages rarely required. Houses formed rings, neighbourhoods, and larger sectors. Open corridors separated residential groups. Communal structures appeared at several levels. Central spaces remained deliberately free of ordinary housing. Even if we knew absolutely nothing about the people who lived there, the plans alone would tell us that these settlements belong to a different category from the small communities surrounding them. Scale, however, does not automatically produce a city. Imagine a modern campsite used by 50,000 people for a large festival. For several days it might contain shops, food distribution, roads, toilets, security, medical services, meeting spaces, and more inhabitants than many permanent towns. Nobody would normally describe it as a new city in the historical sense because its population is temporary and its purpose is limited. That is an exaggerated comparison, but it helps explain why the question of permanent occupation matters so much at Trypillia sites. A map showing 3,000 houses looks immediately urban if we assume all 3,000 were occupied at once. The interpretation changes if only a fraction were occupied simultaneously, while other households visited seasonally or shifted between the megasite and smaller settlements. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological modelling have made this problem harder rather than easier, which is often what happens when research improves. Earlier estimates sometimes imagined very large permanent populations numbering in the tens of thousands. More recent work at Nebelivka has suggested considerably smaller populations under several possible occupation models. Houses accumulated over generations, and not every structure visible on a geophysical survey necessarily stood at the same moment. Researchers working on Nebelivka therefore modelled different ways in which occupation might have functioned, including more permanent settlement and more temporary or seasonal forms of aggregation. Importantly, the researchers who developed these lower population estimates still concluded that Nebelivka and related megasites could reasonably be considered urban when judged relationally, meaning by how dramatically they differed in organisation and scale from contemporary settlements around them. This relational approach changes the question in a useful way. Instead of asking whether Nebelivka resembles Uruk closely enough to qualify as a city, we ask what Nebelivka was within its own social world. Compared with surrounding settlements, it was enormous. It contained planned residential zones, communal architecture, large public spaces, specialised activities, and connections drawing people and resources from a wider region. It created social relationships that could not exist inside a village of 20 households because there were simply too many people and too many different groups involved. From that perspective, urbanism is not a checklist invented from one part of the ancient world. It is a change in the scale and organisation of human interaction. Gajdarska, Nebbia and Chapman have argued from this position that Trypillia megasites can be understood as cities and that they represent an independent route toward urbanism, separate from the more centralised route visible in Mesopotamia. The phrase independent route is important because it removes an old assumption that cities must develop through the same sequence everywhere. Human societies do not receive a standard instruction manual saying that once the population reaches a certain number, they must build a palace, hire accountants, invent taxes, and begin annoying future archaeology students with administrative records. Different communities can solve similar problems differently. Mesopotamian cities increasingly concentrated economic and political management in powerful institutions. Trypillia megasites appear to have relied much more heavily on households, neighbourhoods, quarters, assembly structures, and negotiated cooperation. Both systems could bring together large populations, but the political architecture behind them was different. That difference becomes particularly visible when we look for social hierarchy. In many early cities, inequality becomes physically obvious. Elite houses become larger. Certain burials contain far more wealth. Monumental structures separate rulers or religious institutions from ordinary people. Administrative systems allow surplus to be collected and controlled. The Trypillia evidence is much less dramatic. A recent study examining approximately 7,000 houses from 38 Trypillia settlements used differences in house size as one way of estimating household inequality. The results suggested that inequality actually decreased temporarily during the megasite period, before increasing again later. The authors argue that these giant settlements may have involved social mechanisms that limited major differences between households, at least for several generations. Large-scale settlement, in other words, did not immediately produce an obvious aristocracy living in enormous compounds. House size cannot tell us everything about wealth or power. One family may have owned more cattle, possessed valuable exchange connections, controlled specialised knowledge, or held important ritual roles without living in a mansion. The archaeological evidence could therefore hide forms of inequality that were perfectly visible to people at the time. Still, the lack of extreme architectural differences matters. If thousands of people were living or gathering at these sites, and powerful rulers existed, those rulers were unusually modest about advertising themselves. There are no known royal tombs comparable to those of later states, no clear palaces, and no enormous administrative compounds dominating the settlement plan. Instead, The largest distinctive buildings generally appear to have served communal groups. This brings us to another feature that makes a strong case for urbanism: public architecture. Nebelivka contained numerous large buildings interpreted as assembly structures, including one particularly substantial example near the centre. Maidanetske also had communal structures distributed among its residential sectors. These buildings suggest activities conducted above the level of individual households, where the people gathered to hold ceremonies, eat together, negotiate land use, redistribute resources, discuss disputes, arrange collective work, or combine several of these activities. The settlement contained institutions for managing wider community life. Cities need ways of allowing people who are not close relatives to cooperate. The Trypillia megasites appear to have built those mechanisms physically into the settlement. What they do not appear to have built is one overwhelming central institution. That absence has led some scholars to describe Trypillia urbanism as heterarchical. Instead of a simple pyramid in which one ruler sits at the top, authority may have been distributed across many groups. Small neighbourhoods handled some matters, larger quarters dealt with others, assembly buildings allowed broader participation. Influential individuals probably existed, but political control may have remained difficult for any one lineage to monopolise. An antiquity editorial discussing the Nebelivka research summarised the wider implication clearly. These urban-scale communities may have developed without hierarchy, top-down control, or military force of the type traditionally assumed necessary for early cities. The absence of visible fortifications in the familiar state-centred sense also affects the debate. Some early cities grew partly because walls protected concentrated populations and valuable stores. At Trypillia sites, settlement organisation appears to have been concerned more with internal arrangement than with creating massive defensive architecture around an elite-controlled centre. This does not mean violence was unknown. Prehistoric Europe was not a permanently peaceful place, and we should not confuse a lack of royal armies with a lack of interpersonal or intergroup conflict. It means that military organisation does not appear to have been the defining institution holding these enormous communities together. Economic specialisation gives us another urban feature, although again in an unusual form. Pottery workshops and sophisticated kilns demonstrate significant craft knowledge. Flint and other raw materials moved through regional exchange networks. Salt, copper, stone, and other resources linked communities across long distances. Some residents clearly possess skills that were not distributed equally among every household. Yet specialisation appears to have remained relatively dispersed rather than being concentrated under palace control. This creates a form of economic complexity without the centralised management familiar from later cities. A person could live in a large, interconnected settlement and obtain goods from skilled producers without those producers becoming employees of a state institution. Agriculture creates an equally interesting comparison. Traditional models of early urbanism often separate city from countryside. Farmers produce food outside, while specialists, officials, craftspeople and rulers live inside the city. Trypillia megasites blur that distinction. Their residents seem to have remained closely involved with farming and livestock. Fields and grazing land extended beyond the settlement, but households inside the rings retained strong agricultural roles. Instead of an urban population detached from food production and supported by a rural peasantry, we may be looking at an enormous concentration of farming households that added increasingly specialised and communal activities without abandoning agriculture. That is one reason some archaeologists prefer the term low-density urbanism. A low-density city does not need tightly packed streets or a sharp boundary separating urban residents from agricultural land. Modern archaeology has increasingly recognised that cities can take many physical forms. Some ancient urban landscapes in other parts of the world combine neighbourhoods with gardens, fields, reservoirs, ceremonial spaces, and substantial areas without dense construction. What matters is not simply how many buildings fit into each hectare, but how the settlement organises people, resources, institutions and relationships across space. The Trypillia megasites fit comfortably into that broader understanding. Researchers arguing for their urban status have specifically characterised them as early low-density settlements, whose layout and social organisation differed fundamentally from the small villages around them. Even so, calling them Europe's first cities requires caution for another reason. Europe already contained other unusually large prehistoric settlements and dense communities before the peak of the Trypillia megasites. Sites such as Vinča settlements in the Balkans and the much earlier large settlement of Çatalhöyük in Anatolia complicate any attempt to award a neat title of first city. Whether Anatolia is included in the geographical category being used, whether dense Neolithic settlements qualify as urban, and which definition of city is applied can all change the answer. Archaeologists generally become suspicious when a popular title contains the word first, because the archaeological record has a habit of producing an older example shortly after somebody becomes confident. The safer claim is that the Trypillia megasites represent one of the earliest known experiments in urban-scale settlement in Europe and a remarkably early independent path toward urbanism. That statement is impressive enough without forcing a competition. By the early 4th millennium BCE, people in what is now Ukraine were constructing settlements hundreds of hectares in area, organising houses into planned circuits, building communal facilities, maintaining craft production and exchange networks, and coordinating groups much larger than a normal face-to-face village. They did this before the great urban expansion associated with later Mesopotamian cities, and long before the pyramids at Giza. The importance of Trypillia therefore lies less in winning a chronological race, and more in proving that large-scale urban life could develop through very different political arrangements. There is also a strange historical imbalance in how we remember these societies. Mesopotamia produced writing, and written records have an enormous advantage over silence. Once people begin recording names, transactions, rulers, temples, conflicts, and myths, later historians can build a narrative around individual places and events. Egypt did the same through inscriptions, monuments, royal lists and tombs. Trypillia communities left no comparable textual archive. We do not know what Talianki was called 6,000 years ago, assuming everyone even used one agreed name. We cannot identify its founders. We cannot quote a resident complaining about grain prices. We have no record of a political debate from Maidanetske, and no list of people who gathered inside a Nebelivka assembly building. Their urban experiment survives almost entirely through material traces. The buildings themselves were also poor candidates for long-term fame. Stone monuments can dominate a landscape for thousands of years. Timber and clay houses eventually collapse, decay, burn and disappear beneath fields. What once covered hundreds of hectares can become almost invisible at ground level. The extraordinary plans of the Trypillia megasites only became clear through aerial photography, magnetic survey, excavation, and other modern archaeological techniques. Researchers studying these sites have even described major changes in knowledge as methodological revolutions because improved survey transformed what appeared to be scattered prehistoric remains into complete settlement layouts. This invisibility probably explains why the idea of enormous prehistoric settlements in Ukraine still feels surprising. The physical remains do not announce themselves like a pyramid. You can cross the landscape without realizing that thousands of houses once formed vast rings beneath the fields. Only when geophysical data convert buried traces into a plan do the settlements become visible again. At that moment, our expectations about prehistoric Europe begin to fail. The old picture of small farming communities suddenly has a settlement 300 hectares wide sitting in the middle of it. There is one final problem with calling these places cities, and it may be the most important one. Cities usually leave descendants. A successful urban centre often becomes part of a continuing tradition. Streets are rebuilt, political institutions change, populations grow or decline. One city influences another. Even when individual places collapse, urban life continues elsewhere. The Trypillia megasites did not produce an obvious continuing urban tradition in the region. Researchers who argue strongly for their urban status also emphasize the unusual fact that this route to urbanism left essentially no direct urban legacy for thousands of years. The settlements grew, functioned, changed, and then disappeared. That disappearance once encouraged people to assume they could not have been proper cities. Surely a real city would have developed into something recognizable, perhaps gaining walls, rulers, administration or writing. But that argument quietly assumes that urbanism has one destination. There is no reason a city must eventually become a state capital. A settlement can be urban while the social system supporting it remains temporary. Human societies experiment with ways of living, and some experiments are eventually abandoned even when they worked for generations. In fact, the Trypillia case may be most valuable precisely because the experiment ended. It shows that urban-scale living was not an irreversible stage of development. People could gather in enormous settlements and later decide, or be forced by circumstances to organise life differently. They could create communal institutions and then allow them to disappear. They could build neighbourhoods containing hundreds or thousands of households and later return to smaller settlement patterns. Urbanism did not trap them permanently. That raises a question which definitions alone cannot answer. If the megasites offered access to larger communities, shared institutions, craft specialists, exchange networks, marriage partners, agricultural cooperation, and collective gathering spaces, why did people stop building them? The answer cannot simply be that they did not know how to maintain large settlements, because the tradition lasted for generations. Nor can we assume a single military catastrophe destroyed them all, because the archaeological sequence is more complicated than one moment of conquest. Something changed gradually within the social, economic, and environmental systems that made aggregation worthwhile. Before reaching that problem, however, there is one practice that demands attention, because it sits directly between ordinary household life and the eventual abandonment of the megasites. Across the Cucuteni Trypillia world, houses were repeatedly destroyed by fire, and in many cases the burning appears to have been deliberate. These were buildings that had taken substantial labour to construct and contained the accumulated material of household life, yet people sometimes chose to turn them into intensely burned masses of clay and timber rather than simply letting them decay. At first, this looks like evidence of disaster. The more examples archaeologists examine, the harder that explanation becomes, because fire was not merely something that happened to Trypillia settlements. It appears to have been something Trypillia communities sometimes did to their own buildings, and understanding why they did it brings us much closer to understanding what a house, a settlement, and eventually the abandonment of an entire megasite actually meant. The first thing to clear up is that the Trypillia megasites were not simply destroyed in one enormous wave of fire. When we say that people burned their settlements, the reality was more gradual and much more unusual. Houses were built, lived in, repaired, emptied or rearranged, and then, in many cases, deliberately set on fire at the end of their use. Other houses remained standing or were abandoned without being burned. New buildings could appear elsewhere while the remains of older ones stayed visible. Over generations, this repeated practice produced settlements filled with the traces of thousands of individual fires. At Maidanetske, archaeologists have identified around 3,000 house structures, of which roughly 2,300 were intentionally burned and about 700 were not. At Nebelivka, approximately 2/3 of the houses appear to have been burned intensely, while the rest were weakly burned or left unburned. This was therefore not a rare emergency response. Fire was repeatedly involved in the way Trypillia communities ended the lives of buildings. At first, accidental fire seems like the obvious explanation. The houses contained timber, plant material, clay-covered walls, ovens, hearths, stored fuel, and countless opportunities for something to go wrong. Put a great many such buildings close together, and occasional fires are inevitable. Anyone who has ever left something cooking for slightly too long can appreciate how little encouragement fire sometimes requires. The problem is that accidental burning does not adequately explain the archaeological pattern. Too many houses burned, and many burned at temperatures that appear to have required deliberate effort. Experimental archaeology has been especially useful here, because researchers have actually constructed versions of Trypillia buildings and burned them to see what kinds of remains they produce. Those experiments showed that the timber already contained within a house was often insufficient to create the intense, sustained temperatures represented by the archaeological remains. In the Nebelivka experimental program, researchers concluded that achieving comparable burning could require enormous quantities of additional fuel, in some estimates several times the amount of timber originally used to construct the building. The implication is difficult to avoid. At least many of these houses did not merely catch fire. People helped them burn. Analyses of burned building material support the same conclusion. Clay used in Trypillia walls could become intensely fired when a building burned, preserving evidence of the temperatures reached during the fire. Recent work on material from Maidanetske found that domestic house remains had experienced temperatures in the range of roughly 750 to 850 degrees Celsius, while material from a communal structure suggested somewhat lower but still substantial temperatures of approximately 650 to 750 degrees. Those are serious fires. They would require sustained combustion, particularly if thick clay-covered walls and structural material were to become heavily fired rather than simply blackened around the edges. Experimental reconstructions have shown that producing the dense masses of fired daub found at archaeological sites requires a fire to remain hot enough for long enough that simply setting a corner of the roof alight is unlikely to be sufficient. That changes the scene considerably. Imagine a household deciding that a building had reached the end of its useful life. Possessions might first be removed, although not necessarily everything. Materials could be placed inside deliberately. Additional timber or other fuel might be gathered. People would have to prepare the structure and then ignite it, while controlling a fire capable of reaching very high temperatures. This would not be a private activity easily hidden from neighbours. A burning Trypillia house would produce heat, smoke, light, noise, collapsing timber, and an enormous amount of attention. If several households participated, the event may have drawn much of a neighbourhood together. The destruction of the house could therefore become a social occasion as much as a practical one. This is one reason archaeologists have moved away from thinking of the burning simply as demolition. Houses in many prehistoric societies carried meanings that went far beyond their value as shelter. A house could be associated with a family, a lineage, marriages, births, deaths, meals, ceremonies, stored objects, and memories accumulated across years. People may have understood a building as having its own history. It was constructed at a particular moment, occupied by particular people, changed as the household changed, and eventually reached an end. If the house was closely connected with the identity of those who lived there, destroying it in a controlled and memorable way could have marked the end of that household phase. Researchers studying Trypillia burning have sometimes described this idea as the death of a house. The phrase sounds dramatic, but it captures something useful. A building may have been treated less like disposable property, and more like something whose end needed to be recognised. Archaeologists working at Nebelivka have described some burned house deposits as house death assemblages, meaning that the objects found in them may not simply represent everything that happened to be sitting inside when flames unexpectedly arrived. Instead, at least some material appears to have been selected, brought together, broken, deposited, or otherwise arranged as part of the burning event. This makes the burned building resemble a carefully created deposit, rather than the contents of an abandoned kitchen preserved by bad luck. That distinction matters when archaeologists examine pottery. If a house burned suddenly during ordinary occupation, we might expect to find a fairly normal collection of domestic equipment trapped inside: storage vessels, cooking containers, tools, food processing equipment, and whatever else the household had been using. At Nebelivka, however, researchers found that burned house assemblages often did not resemble complete sets of everyday household equipment. Certain objects were present while other expected categories were surprisingly scarce. That suggests people could remove much of the ordinary household material before the burning and then place selected objects back into the building or around it. The fire therefore becomes something prepared rather than something merely suffered. The burning of the largest communal building excavated at Nebelivka makes this especially clear. This structure was enormous by Trypillia standards, measuring about 60 metres long and 18 metres wide. Before or during its destruction, large quantities of pottery were involved, representing at least several hundred vessels. Many seem to have been associated with communal consumption, and differences in the clay fabric suggest that vessels may have been contributed by people from multiple households or neighbourhoods. 21 miniature vessels were also found in connection with the building, along with other unusual objects. It is difficult to interpret an event like this as somebody accidentally leaving an oven unattended. The destruction appears to have involved collective participation on a scale appropriate to the importance of the building itself. Perhaps people gathered for a final meal before the structure burned. Perhaps households brought vessels representing their participation in the wider community. Perhaps the building had served as a meeting place for years, and its destruction marked a major political or ceremonial change. We cannot know the sequence in enough detail to reconstruct the event minute by minute, and there is a danger in giving prehistoric people a ritual script simply because we find something difficult to explain economically. Still, the combination of deliberate burning, selected deposits, communal architecture, and contributions from several groups makes it reasonable to think that at least some fires had social or ceremonial significance. There were also practical reasons for burning an old house. Timber and clay buildings eventually deteriorate. Roofs fail, structural posts decay, floors wear out, and repairing an aging building can eventually require more effort than replacing it. Fire offers a way of clearing part of the structure while transforming clay wall material into a compact mass. Yet practical demolition alone does not explain why people sometimes invested additional fuel in producing extremely intense fires, nor why burnt remains were occasionally preserved as visible features rather than simply cleared away. If efficiency were the only goal, carefully gathering enough fuel to turn an old house into a furnace would be a rather extravagant solution. The remains themselves provide one of the most interesting clues. At Nebelivka, some burned houses formed low mounds of fired clay that remained visible above the surrounding surface. Researchers estimate that around 10% of the houses produce such features, which they call memory mounds. Instead of completely clearing the debris and immediately placing another house directly on top, inhabitants sometimes allowed these low heaps to remain. As more houses were burned through generations, the settlement accumulated more of them. A living neighbourhood could therefore contain the visible remains of households that had existed earlier. The megasite gradually became a place shared by current residents and the physical traces of previous residents. That is unusual compared with some other prehistoric settlement traditions. In parts of the Balkans, houses were repeatedly rebuilt on nearly the same location, eventually producing thick settlement mounds known as tells. One generation effectively lived above the architectural remains of another. At Nebelivka, direct rebuilding on precisely the same footprint was less common. The memory mound offered another way of maintaining continuity. Instead of constructing the new house directly over the old one, people could leave the remains visible nearby. A child growing up in the settlement might pass the burned mound of a house belonging to grandparents or earlier relatives. Stories could attach themselves to these places. The settlement map would then contain social history that could be read by residents even without writing. This may help explain why burning was worth the effort. Fire changes ordinary materials into something much harder to erase. An unburned timber and clay house abandoned to weather would gradually collapse and disappear. Wood rots. Unfired clay returns to soil. Roof material decays. After enough time, the building becomes difficult to distinguish from the ground around it. Intense burning transforms clay into fired material that can survive for thousands of years. The Trypillia inhabitants obviously did not know archaeologists would eventually thank them for this, but they would have understood the immediate difference. A burned house leaves a durable, visible trace. In that sense, destruction could preserve the presence of a household in the landscape. The connection between fire and memory does not require every burning to have exactly the same meaning. The Cucuteni Trypillia tradition lasted for many centuries across an enormous area. It would be surprising if one explanation applied unchanged to every house from Romania to central Ukraine and across generations of social change. One family may have burned a building when its occupants moved. Another could have associated burning with death. A neighbourhood might destroy houses as part of a wider rebuilding cycle. A communal structure could be burned when the institution using it was reorganised. Seasonal communities might burn particular buildings to mark the end of an aggregation period. Several motives could exist at once. Household death is one possibility often discussed because homes are so closely associated with the people occupying them. If a senior family member died, perhaps the house could no longer be treated as an ordinary living space. Burning might transform both the building and the relationship between the living and the dead. The difficulty is that human remains are remarkably rare in most Trypillia settlements, so there is no simple pattern in which a body is found inside every burned house. If houses were routinely burned whenever someone died, we might expect more direct evidence. Either the dead were treated elsewhere, the relationship between death and burning was symbolic rather than literal, or death was only one of several possible triggers. One unusual site, Maidanetske in Ukraine, reminds us not to make the burning practice too neat. Archaeologists recovered fragmented remains representing at least 7 people from and around one burned house there, including children, younger individuals, and adults. Detailed analysis suggests that several may have died around the time the house burned. Some bones were affected by fire at temperatures comparable to those recorded from Trypillia house-burning experiments, while others remained unburned. Researchers concluded that death in a fire is a plausible explanation for at least some of the individuals, though they could not determine whether the fire itself was accidental or deliberately started. There are also indications of possible lethal trauma in 2 individuals, making the event still more complicated. Maidanetske therefore warns us that not every burned house should automatically be treated as a peaceful ritual closure. Real accidents, violence, and unexpected deaths could occur inside a cultural tradition where deliberate burning was also common. The scale of controlled burning also raises a very practical question about safety. If thousands of houses existed within the same megasite, why did intentionally burning one not destroy half the settlement? The answer may lie partly in the settlement layout. Trypillia houses were not packed together as tightly as buildings in many later cities. Neighbourhoods contained gaps, and large corridors separated rings or sectors. Those open spaces may have reduced the risk of fire spreading uncontrollably. A planned burning could also be scheduled when weather conditions were suitable, and neighbouring structures were prepared. Water, earth, cleared ground, and watchful participants might help contain the flames. We should not underestimate people who had lived with open fires every day of their lives. They understood combustion more directly than most modern viewers, whose main interaction with fire is occasionally struggling to light a barbecue. Even controlled burning would have consumed large amounts of fuel, which creates another puzzle. Experimental work at Nebelivka concluded that fully burning a house could require far more timber than constructing one in the first place. If that estimate is approximately correct for archaeological events, deliberately burning hundreds or thousands of buildings represents a major investment of woodland resources. This seems especially surprising because these communities already needed timber for construction, roofing supports, tools, fencing, heating, cooking, pottery firing and other work. A society dependent on wood would not casually waste enormous quantities of it, unless the burning served purposes important enough to justify the cost. At the same time, the number of houses burned each year may have been much smaller than the final archaeological total makes it appear. Nebelivka existed for many generations. If only a limited number of houses were constructed and destroyed in a typical year, the timber demand becomes more manageable. This is another example of why looking at the complete site plan can be misleading. 1,400 houses burned over a long settlement. History is very different from 1,400 houses burning during one terrible afternoon. The archaeological record compresses repeated events into a single landscape. The practice may even have helped regulate the rhythm of settlement growth. A household builds a house, occupies it for a period, then destroys it deliberately and builds elsewhere. Over time, households move through the settlement without necessarily expanding the simultaneous population. New buildings represent replacement as well as growth. The rings therefore accumulate houses while the number of occupied dwellings remains relatively stable. Some researchers working on Nebelivka have incorporated exactly this kind of cycle into models of the settlement, proposing that a limited number of houses could have been constructed and burned each year, while the megasite continued to function with a much smaller permanent population than the total house count suggests. That makes house burning important to the population debate, as well as to ritual interpretation. Every burned structure becomes a marker of time. If houses had finite use lives and were regularly destroyed, the final geophysical map represents generations of occupation layered horizontally across the landscape, rather than thousands of households living simultaneously. The very feature that made the megasites look enormous may partly record their duration. There is another possibility that becomes especially interesting if some megasites functioned seasonally. People arriving from smaller settlements may have maintained houses associated with particular groups and returned to them during major gatherings. Burning a house could mark the end of a period of membership, the completion of a generational cycle, or the conclusion of a group's responsibility within the wider community. Researchers have proposed several models for Nebelivka, in which seasonal assembly and distributed governance played important roles. In such a system, burning could help mark transitions that were political as well as domestic. The fire would say that something had ended and that space could now be reorganized. Fire also creates spectacle, and spectacle matters in communities without writing or monumental stone architecture. A large burning house can be seen from far away. People gather around it. The event is memorable. Children who witness it may remember it decades later. If objects are deposited beforehand, if food is shared, if speeches or ceremonies occur, the destruction becomes an event through which collective history is transmitted. A written society can record that a household ended in a document. A society without writing can make the ending impossible to forget by setting the house on fire. There is no need to imagine solemn silence around every burning. Some could have involved feasting, conversation, exchange, and practical work. Others could have been emotionally difficult if the house was associated with deaths or the departure of relatives. A communal building might attract people from across the settlement, while the burning of a small domestic structure could involve only a neighbourhood. The same basic practice could operate at different social scales. What united them was transformation. A usable building became a permanent deposit. Timber disappeared. Clay hardened. Objects were broken or altered. A familiar domestic space became something that belonged to the past. This explains why archaeologists increasingly hesitate to call the fires destruction in the ordinary sense. Destruction suggests that the goal is simply to remove something. Trypillia burning often seems to have created something new. The result could be a mound, a deposit of objects, a marked place, or a memory attached to a neighbourhood. The house stopped functioning as a residence but continued functioning socially. People could still recognise where it had stood. The settlement retained the trace even after the household had moved on. That distinction becomes crucial when we think about the eventual disappearance of the megasites themselves, because the presence of burned houses does not mean the settlements were destroyed by enemies or consumed by a final catastrophe. In many cases, burning was already part of normal Trypillia life centuries before the giant settlements came to an end. Archaeologists, therefore, cannot simply point to fire and conclude that invasion destroyed Talianki or Maidanetske. The fires were happening while the system was still functioning. Nor does widespread burning demonstrate that residents deliberately incinerated an entire megasite before leaving forever. Individual houses were burned at different times. Some remained unburned. Certain communal structures were destroyed in apparently carefully organised events. Other buildings simply fell out of use. The final abandonment of a megasite was therefore the outcome of many household decisions spread through time, rather than one spectacular bonfire visible across the Ukrainian steppe. That actually makes the disappearance more difficult to explain. A conquering army would give us a convenient ending. So would a single environmental disaster. Instead, the evidence suggests communities that were already accustomed to building, ending, and rebuilding domestic spaces as part of normal social life. At some point, however, people stopped replacing enough of them. A burned house was no longer followed by another house somewhere else, within the same enormous settlement. Neighbourhoods thinned, communal buildings ceased to function. The systems of cooperation that had brought thousands of households together began to lose their hold. By the later 4th millennium BCE, the megasite tradition was weakening. Changes in settlement size, communal architecture, social inequality, farming organisation, regional networks, and perhaps relationships with populations beyond the Trypillia world were all taking place. No single burned house explains that change, but the practice allows us to watch it at the scale of individual households. Every house represented a decision to remain connected to the settlement. Building another one meant renewing that connection. Choosing not to rebuild meant something different. For generations, Trypillia communities had been remarkably willing to invest in these places. They gathered timber, clay, labour, food, livestock, pottery, and social effort to maintain settlements larger than anything most contemporary Europeans had seen. They created neighbourhoods without obvious kings, managed agricultural landscapes collectively, maintained exchange networks, and deliberately burned homes in ways that transformed household history into physical memory. Then those investments gradually stopped making sense. The question we are left with is not why one building burned, because we can now see that burning was often part of how the society worked. The more important question is why people eventually stopped building the next one, and that takes us into the final centuries of the megasites, when Europe's extraordinary early experiment with urban-scale life began to come apart. By the time the largest Trypillia settlements had been standing for generations, their inhabitants had already solved problems that should have made communities of this scale extremely difficult to maintain. They had found ways to feed large populations without a visible palace administration collecting grain. They had divided settlement space into households, neighbourhoods, and larger groups. They had built communal structures where people could gather, maintained pottery production and exchange networks, managed cattle across broad grazing territories, and repeatedly rebuilt a social system in which thousands of people could belong to the same enormous settlement without leaving us much evidence for kings, armies, or a permanent bureaucracy. Then, sometime after about 3800 BCE, the pattern began to change. The largest settlements stopped growing. Smaller communities appeared around them. Some communal institutions changed or disappeared. Differences between households seem to have increased. By roughly 3650 to 3500 BCE, the great period of population aggregation was coming to an end, and the landscape that had once contained settlements covering hundreds of hectares was becoming a landscape of smaller communities again. The Trypillia cultural tradition itself continued, but its extraordinary experiment with megasites did not. There is something tempting about a disappearance like this because it encourages us to look for one dramatic cause. Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps farming exhausted the soil. Perhaps outsiders attacked. Perhaps disease spread through the large settlements. Perhaps inequality destroyed cooperation. Perhaps people simply discovered that living with several thousand neighbours was more trouble than it was worth. an explanation with a certain everyday appeal, even if archaeology requires something more substantial. The difficulty is that no single explanation comfortably accounts for everything we see. The megasites were not all abandoned on the same day, and the people who left them did not simply vanish. Settlement patterns changed gradually, communities dispersed, new settlements were founded, social institutions shifted, contacts with neighbouring populations continued. What disappeared was not necessarily the population itself, but a particular way of organising that population. Environmental collapse used to seem like an especially sensible explanation. Large settlements require food, timber, grazing land, water, clay and fuel. Thousands of houses require construction material. Pottery kilns consume fuel. Deliberately burning houses can consume still more. Cattle need pasture, fields need cultivation, and people need firewood every day. Put enough farmers in one area for enough generations, and it is easy to imagine the surrounding landscape becoming exhausted. Forests retreat, soils lose fertility, grazing pressure increases, harvests decline, and eventually the settlement becomes impossible to support. This is a familiar explanation for the decline of many ancient societies, and it sounds particularly convincing when we remember just how large places such as Talianki and Maidanetske were. The archaeological evidence, however, refuses to cooperate with a simple ecological disaster story. Environmental research at Nebelivka examined indicators including pollen, charcoal, erosion, deforestation, and water conditions. If an enormous permanent population had spent generations stripping the surrounding landscape to support itself, researchers expected a strong ecological signal. They did not find one on the scale anticipated. The local environment certainly changed through human activity, as farming landscapes always do, but the evidence did not show the kind of catastrophic pressure that would neatly explain why the megasite had to be abandoned. This finding also contributed to the argument that Nebelivka may have supported fewer simultaneous residents than the total number of houses initially suggested, or that some occupation may have been periodic rather than fully permanent. Either way, environmental destruction alone does not appear to provide the missing answer. The farming system itself looks surprisingly capable. Stable isotope research on plants and animal remains has revealed a carefully organised agricultural economy in which cattle played an important part in maintaining crop production. Some animals were intensively pastured, manure could be directed toward fields, and pulses and cereals made substantial contributions to human diets. Researchers examining these systems concluded that there was no obvious economic reason why the megasites simply had to fail because they could no longer feed themselves. Their agricultural strategies were sophisticated enough to sustain large communities over multiple generations. That does not mean harvest failures never occurred, or that every household enjoyed uninterrupted abundance. Farming before modern machinery was labour-intensive and vulnerable to weather in any period. It means the evidence does not currently support a straightforward story in which the soil gave up and everyone was forced to leave. Climate change presents a similar problem. The 4th millennium BCE was not climatically motionless, and communities across Europe experienced changing environmental conditions. Rainfall patterns, temperatures, vegetation, and the productivity of particular landscapes could all shift over time. Such changes would have affected Trypillia farmers. A few difficult harvests could increase tension inside a settlement, especially if some households had better access to animals, storage, pasture or exchange partners than others. Yet climate operates through society rather than pushing a large red button marked collapse. The same dry period can damage one community, be manageable for another, and create opportunities for a third. If the Trypillia megasites declined partly during environmental change, we still need to explain why their particular form of social organisation became vulnerable. A disease explanation has also attracted attention, especially as ancient DNA has revealed that prehistoric Eurasia contained forms of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for later historical plague. Recent genetic research has shown that plague circulated among Neolithic populations in parts of Europe and could produce repeated outbreaks. That discovery makes epidemic disease an important factor to consider whenever large prehistoric populations and long-distance networks are involved. Concentrating people, livestock, food stores, visitors, and exchange connections can create excellent conditions for pathogens, even when nobody understands what a pathogen is. A megasite could theoretically turn a local infection into a regional problem with impressive efficiency. The trouble is that we do not currently have direct evidence showing that plague brought down the Trypillia megasites. The securely identified prehistoric plague cases that have transformed our understanding of the disease do not provide a neat epidemic trail through Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka at exactly the moment the aggregation system began breaking apart. Disease may eventually prove to have played some role in wider demographic changes, but making it the main explanation at present would run ahead of the evidence. The same caution applies to other diseases that would leave little or no recognisable archaeological trace. People living in large communities certainly became ill. Epidemics may have occurred. What we cannot yet do is turn that reasonable possibility into the cause of the megasite decline. Another popular explanation has been invasion from the steppe. This version of the story is easy to imagine because the Trypillia settlement stood close to a zone where mobile pastoralist societies were developing, and later prehistoric Europe would be transformed by major movements of steppe-related populations. It is tempting to picture peaceful farmers living in enormous settlements until mounted outsiders suddenly appeared and swept the whole system away. The chronology and archaeological evidence make that simple scenario difficult to sustain. Contacts between farming populations and people connected with the steppe existed well before the later Yamnaya expansions, and genetic evidence shows Eastern Europe was already a zone of interaction between groups with different ancestries and ways of life. The major migrations commonly associated with Yamnaya ancestry across large parts of Europe came later than the initial disintegration of the classic Trypillia megasite system. Interaction, exchange, competition, and occasional violence are all plausible, but a single conquering invasion is not necessary to explain why people began leaving the giant settlements. The most interesting explanation may therefore be the least dramatic one. The social system stopped delivering the advantages that had once persuaded people to participate in it. Recent work on household inequality provides an important clue. Researchers compared the floor areas of roughly 7,000 houses from 38 Trypillia settlements and used differences in house size as one possible measure of economic inequality. During the early period of population aggregation, inequality appears to have declined. The huge settlements may actually have been places where communities developed effective mechanisms for limiting large differences between households. That fits what we have already seen in the settlement plans. There was no enormous palace belonging to one family. Communal buildings were distributed across neighbourhoods and larger residential groups. Decision-making may have involved several levels of assemblies, resources required negotiation, and the settlement could function only if many households continued to cooperate. For a while, that system seems to have worked remarkably well. People were attracted to large aggregation sites, and the benefits are not difficult to imagine. A larger community offered more exchange partners, more potential spouses, more skilled craftspeople, larger labour pools, broader social networks, and better possibilities for sharing risk. A household suffering a poor harvest had more relationships through which assistance might be available. Someone needing help building a house could mobilise neighbours and relatives. Potters and flint workers could serve larger groups. Ceremonies and communal meals could strengthen alliances between people who did not live in the same immediate neighbourhood. Joining a megasite meant accepting additional obligations, but it also meant gaining access to resources and relationships that a small, isolated settlement could not provide. Large population also creates what researchers sometimes call scalar stress, which is a fairly formal expression for the observation that adding more people tends to add more problems. More households mean more competing interests. Pasture must be divided among more livestock owners, Communal buildings serve more groups. Exchange networks create opportunities for some families to become better connected than others. Skilled individuals can gain influence. Representatives who repeatedly participate in wider decision-making may accumulate knowledge and authority unavailable to households less involved in those institutions. The system that initially distributes power can gradually begin concentrating it, even if nobody starts with a plan to become ruler. Evidence from communal architecture appears to track something like this change. During earlier phases, smaller assembly buildings were distributed across different parts of large settlements, potentially allowing neighbourhoods and intermediate groups to participate directly in collective decisions. From around 3800 BCE, researchers have observed a reduction in some of these smaller communal structures alongside the increasing importance and elaboration of larger central buildings. At the same time, differences in house sizes began increasing again. One interpretation is that political participation was becoming less evenly distributed. Decisions that had previously been handled through many local institutions may have started moving toward fewer, more centralized places. This does not require us to imagine a prehistoric politician announcing that from now on every pasture decision must come through his office. Social centralization can occur gradually. Perhaps certain groups controlled important exchange connections. Perhaps households associated with particular communal buildings became more influential. Maybe wealthier livestock owners were better able to survive difficult years and expand their position. Some families could have accumulated prestige through craft production, ritual roles, or access to imported materials. The exact mechanism is uncertain, but once advantages become uneven, the political bargain that made aggregation attractive begins to change. A household participating in a megasite had alternatives. That may have been one of the most important differences between Trypillia communities and later state cities. There was no obvious government preventing people from leaving. Families knew how to build houses elsewhere. Smaller settlements already existed across the surrounding region. Agricultural skills were portable. Livestock could move. Relatives and social partners could relocate together. When living in the megasite stopped providing enough advantages, residents did not necessarily need to organise a revolution. They could simply go. Settlement evidence suggests that something like this was happening. After around 3800 BCE, the process of concentrating populations in larger and larger settlements began reversing in important Trypillia regions. As the largest communities declined, numerous smaller settlements appeared around them. Researchers have interpreted at least some of these as communities formed by groups leaving the megasites. Instead of one giant settlement suddenly becoming empty, residential populations may have fragmented into smaller units that spread across the surrounding landscape. The megasite did not necessarily collapse in the way a building collapses. It lost participants. That would also explain why we do not find one obvious destruction horizon marking the end. Houses had always been built and burned. Neighbourhoods had always changed. People were already accustomed to mobility. The decisive difference was whether a household replaced its old house within the aggregation system or established its next home somewhere else. Imagine that only a small proportion of households make that decision at first. The megasite continues operating. Then more leave. The remaining residents have fewer neighbours to share labour with. Certain communal institutions lose participants. Pottery workshops serve smaller markets. Pasture arrangements need revision. Ceremonies become less impressive because fewer groups attend. The advantages of remaining decline further, encouraging still more departures. This creates a feedback loop that does not require disaster. A large settlement exists because people expect other people to be there. A market is useful because buyers and sellers arrive. A communal institution matters because many groups recognize it. An exchange centre works because routes continue passing through it. Once participation drops below some practical level, the institution becomes less valuable, even if nothing physical has happened to the building. A 6,000-year-old assembly house could be perfectly intact and still become politically useless if the groups expected to meet inside it have moved 20 kilometres away. Changing settlement patterns may also have altered the balance between mobility and permanence. Life inside a megasite brought households into unusually close and repeated relationships, but living in smaller communities gave families more direct access to nearby fields and grazing areas. Agricultural travel distances became shorter. Decisions could be made within smaller groups. Disputes involved fewer competing neighbourhoods. A household gave up some of the advantages of massive aggregation in exchange for greater local control. Once wider exchange and kinship networks had already been created through generations of megasite life, people might even have preserved many regional connections without continuing to live together in one enormous place. The irony is that the success of the megasites may have helped make their abandonment possible. For generations, they created connections between households that previously belonged to more dispersed communities. People met one another, exchanged goods, married across groups, learned shared traditions, and developed regional identities. When they later dispersed, they did not return to the same social world that had existed before the megasites. They carried those connections with them. The giant settlements could disappear while the relationships created inside them continued across a different pattern of smaller communities. Wider changes beyond the Trypillia world were happening as well. Mobile pastoralist lifeways were becoming increasingly important in the steppe and forest steppe zones. Technologies of animal management, transport and mobility continued to develop. Communities interacted across ecological boundaries, exchanging animals, goods, and eventually ancestry. The late 4th millennium BCE was a period of considerable transformation across Eastern Europe, not an isolated Trypillia crisis happening inside a sealed cultural box. A settlement system that had been highly successful under one network of relationships might become less useful as economic and social connections shifted toward different forms of mobility. This is where the word disappearance can be misleading. Talianki did not vanish into the ground while its residents vanished from history. The Cucuteni Trypillia tradition did not end at the exact moment the megasites declined. Later, Trypillia communities continued into the 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE in different forms and different regions. Pottery traditions changed, settlement patterns changed, interactions with neighbouring groups changed, populations mixed and moved. What disappeared first was the particular institution of gigantic settlement aggregation that had defined the earlier period. There may never be one final explanation because different megasites probably ended for somewhat different combinations of reasons. Nebelivka may not have followed exactly the same trajectory as Maidanetske. A settlement partly dependent on seasonal gatherings would respond differently to social change than one with a larger permanent population. Environmental pressures could matter more in one region than another. Exchange routes could shift. A sequence of poor harvests might intensify tensions already developing over inequality. Disease could weaken particular communities without leaving evidence we can identify. Conflict with neighbouring groups could influence local decisions. Archaeologists are trying to reconstruct a process that unfolded across centuries, hundreds of kilometres, and thousands of households, so an answer involving one cause would almost be suspiciously convenient. What the newer research does allow us to say is that the megasites were not obviously doomed by their economy. Their farming system could support large populations. There is no clear evidence that environmental degradation alone forced their abandonment. There is no convincing sign of one invading army destroying them all. Instead, the strongest recent interpretations emphasize political participation, social balance, and the choices made by households. The communities appear to have been able to reduce inequality for a considerable period, but from around 3800 BCE, those mechanisms weakened as differences between households increased and political organisation became more centralised. The decline of the large settlements began around the same time. That makes the end of the Trypillia megasites almost as unusual as their beginning. We usually tell the history of cities as a history of increasing concentration. Villages grow, populations rise, institutions become stronger. Administration expands, leaders accumulate power. Writing appears, states emerge. Once urban life begins, the story seems to point naturally toward larger cities and more centralized governments. The Trypillia evidence shows that none of those steps is automatic. People can create an urban-scale community without creating a kingdom, and they can later abandon urban-scale aggregation without suffering total social collapse. Perhaps the residents of these places eventually decided, collectively or household by household, that the balance had changed. The settlement that once made life more secure now required too much negotiation. The communal system that once gave neighbourhoods a voice now gave more influence to fewer groups. The networks that once required everyone to gather in one enormous place could now be maintained differently. Smaller settlements offered advantages that the megasite no longer did. There did not need to be a final meeting in which everyone agreed to close Maidanetske. People only needed to stop choosing it. Over the following generations, houses burned and were not replaced. Paths became less frequently used. Communal structures fell out of activity. Fields that had supported concentrated populations could be worked by smaller communities. Grazing patterns changed. Pottery continued to be made somewhere else. Children grew up in settlements smaller than the places where their grandparents had lived. Eventually, the rings that had once organised thousands of homes became archaeological features beneath the soil. For thousands of years, almost no one looking across those fields would have understood what was underneath them. Timber disappeared. Unfired clay returned to earth. Burned walls survived as buried masses. The plans of entire settlements remained invisible until aerial survey, excavation, magnetometry, radiocarbon dating, environmental analysis, and other modern methods gradually reconstructed them. What emerged was a version of prehistoric Europe very different from the familiar picture of scattered farmers waiting patiently for urban civilization to arrive from somewhere else. More than 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, communities in Eastern Europe were already experimenting with settlements on a scale that forces us to reconsider what early urbanism could look like. They arranged thousands of houses in enormous planned circuits. They maintained communal buildings and open gathering spaces. They organised farming and livestock across large territories. They produced sophisticated pottery, participated in regional exchange networks, and developed ways of making collective decisions without leaving behind an obvious class of kings. Whether we finally decide to call Talianki, Maidanetske and Nebelivka cities, proto-cities, aggregation centres, or simply megasites, the archaeological fact remains the same. People were solving urban-scale problems there during the early 4th millennium BCE. Their greatest achievement may not have been building something enormous. Human beings have always been capable of gathering large workforces when enough authority or force is available. The unusual part is that Trypillia communities appear to have maintained these settlements for generations, while keeping political and economic differences comparatively limited. The system was not perfectly equal, it was not timeless, and eventually it changed. That makes it more useful rather than less. It shows us that hierarchy was one possible answer to the problem of living together at scale, not the only answer available, and that is why their disappearance matters. The megasites did not fail because prehistoric Europeans were incapable of becoming urban. They demonstrate almost the opposite. These communities created a form of urban-scale life, sustained it long enough for generations to be born into it, and then reorganised themselves when the institution supporting it no longer worked in the same way. The emptying of the megasites was not the end of civilization in the region. It was the end of one particular social arrangement. So the next time prehistoric Europe brings to mind a few small houses surrounded by forest, it may be worth adding another image. Somewhere on the forest steppe of what is now Ukraine, thousands of houses curve around enormous open spaces. Cattle move out toward pasture in the morning. Pottery kilns are operating in different neighbourhoods. People carry grain and clay along paths between rings of buildings. Groups meet inside large communal structures. Visitors arrive from smaller settlements. A household prepares to burn an old house while another begins constructing a new one. There is no pyramid rising above the community and no palace announcing who rules it. But the settlement stretches for hundreds of hectares because generations of people have agreed in one way or another to keep living together there. Then the agreement changes and the people move on. That may be the most important thing these forgotten settlements can tell us. Cities are not simply collections of buildings, and they are not guaranteed stages on a straight road towards states, kings, and empires. They exist because people continue participating in the relationships that make large communities possible. The Cucuteni Trypillia megasites show us an early version of that process with unusual clarity. Households came together, built something enormous without an obvious monarchy, maintained it through cooperation and negotiation, and eventually chose other arrangements when the balance shifted. And with that, we can leave the great rings of Talianki, Maidanetske, and Nebelivka, where archaeologists found them, beneath the fields of Eastern Europe, still holding questions that new surveys and excavations continue to refine. If you enjoyed spending this time in a part of prehistory that rarely receives the attention it deserves, you can leave the video a like and subscribe to Just About Earth. And I would be interested to know what you think after seeing the evidence. Should these places be called Europe's first cities? Or does the word megasite describe something genuinely different that deserves a category of its own? Either way, the people who built them were organising communities of astonishing scale long before the pyramids appeared at Giza. And for several centuries they demonstrated that one of humanity's earliest experiments with urban life could look very different from the kings, palaces and monuments that came later.